He was the heir. This is the foundational fact about him, and it has to be established at the beginning because every subsequent dimension of his life has been organized around it. From his earliest weeks in June 1982, the institution had committed itself to him as the future king. The framework that had absorbed his mother and his father and the various other figures of the British royal family had absorbed him too, with the kind of particular intensity that the heir's position required. He had not chosen the position, he had been born into it. The position would, across the next 4 decades and across whatever decades remained to him, define every dimension of what he could and could not be. The figure he has become is the figure the institution has produced. He is, by every available external measure, the most successful working senior royal of his generation. His marriage to Catherine Middleton has produced 3 children whom the British public has watched grow up across their respective childhoods. His public engagement with the various charitable and ceremonial duties that his position requires has been conducted with the kind of brisk, competent dignity that the institution had been hoping for. He is, by polling that has been conducted across his adult life, one of the most popular members of the British royal family in modern history. The institution that had organized itself around him has, in nearly every visible measure, produced what it had been organized to produce. There are other dimensions. There are the dimensions that have not been part of the public version of him. The temperamental features that those who have served him at close range have catalogued across decades, the sharp impatience, the documented temper, the institutional intensity that has not always softened in the small daily reality of his working life. The red mist that his younger brother described in Spare in January 2023, the moment of physical confrontation at Nottingham Cottage in 2019 that Harry has alleged occurred, and that Kensington Palace has, across the years since the allegation became public, declined to address. The going ballistic that the historian Robert Lacey documented in his account of William's response to the bullying allegations against Meghan in 2018. The institutional rigor that William has applied across his adult life to the figures and situations that have threatened the institutional structures he was raised to protect. This documentary is about the women whose lives have run parallel to his, 4 women in particular. The mother he lost when he was 15, the wife he married in his late 20s after an 8-year courtship that produced in the British tabloids of the period the nickname Waity Katie, the woman whose name was attached to him in 2019 in a controversy that the British media has, in the years since, been quietly removing from its archives, the sister-in-law whose institutional reception included his documented role in the family's response to her arrival. Each of these 4 women paid a different price. Diana paid in the institutional pressures of her marriage and, eventually, in her death. Pressures that her son William would observe across his entire childhood, and that would in different forms shape the institutional posture he has carried into his adult life. Catherine paid in the 8 years she waited for William's commitment to materialize into engagement, in the press scrutiny that the Waity Katie framing produced, and in the complicated subsequent reality of her marriage to a figure whose temperamental features had been formed by conditions her own upbringing had not prepared her for. Rose Hanbury paid in the institutional silencing of the rumors that emerged in 2019, the legal threats, the systematic removal of stories from British media outlets, the production by William's institutional position of the kind of protection that the woman whose name had been attached to him did not herself benefit from. Meghan Markle paid in the heir's institutional hostility toward her presence in the family, the documented going ballistic of William's response to the staff allegations against her, the instruction to divide the households immediately, the cumulative effect that contributed to the rupture of January 2020, and the years of estrangement that have followed. 4 women, 4 different prices. The figure at the center of the 4 prices is the figure this documentary will examine. The framework that had produced him had been the framework's institutional discipline applied to a child born to be king. The discipline had produced its intended outcome. It had produced the heir the institution required. It had also produced, in dimensions that the institution's traditional codes were organized to keep contained, the temperamental features that the 4 women in his life had absorbed across the various forms of their respective relationships with him. Before diving deeper on that, consider subscribing our channel and push the bell icon so you get all the updates about our channel. The title of this documentary is the framing that the cumulative pattern produces when the 4 prices are examined together. The framing is not the whole truth. No single framing is. The framing is, however, one of the available frames through which the documented record of his adult life can be understood. The understanding that the documentary will produce across its 8 parts is the understanding that the 4 women's experiences taken together have made available. Each woman's case is real, each price was paid. The figure at the center of the prices is the figure the institution has been organized to maintain across the entirety of his adult life. This documentary is about that figure and about the 4 women whose lives have intersected with his. The historical record now holds the pattern that the 4 cases examined together have made visible. He was born on the 21st of June 1982 at the Lindo wing of St Mary's Hospital, Paddington, London. The birth was the first child born to a Princess of Wales in over 100 years. The previous Princess of Wales who had given birth, Alexandra of Denmark, had produced her last child in 1869. The institutional weight of the moment was substantial. The country had been preparing for the birth across the months of Diana's pregnancy. The British press had been documenting every dimension of the pregnancy with the kind of sustained attention that the modern royal family had, by 1982, become accustomed to receiving. The boy who emerged was the future king. This was the institutional fact that produced his immediate reception. He had been the heir from the moment of his birth. The framework that had organized his arrival had been organized around the assumption that he would eventually occupy the throne his father was eventually expected to occupy. The succession had been the institutional architecture his life had been positioned within from his earliest seconds. He was named William Arthur Philip Lewis. The choice of names had been the institutional decision that the senior royal family had made in consultation with Charles and Diana. William had been the name his parents had selected for the family's daily use, the name that carried the institutional weight of multiple previous British monarchs without producing the immediate constraint of any single one. Arthur was the name with the deepest mythological resonance in the British royal naming tradition, the name of the legendary King of the Britons, the name that previous princes had often included in their full Christian names. Philip was the name of his paternal grandfather, the consort of Queen Elizabeth II, whose institutional position had been one of the foundational figures of the post-war British royal family. Lewis was the name of his great-great-uncle Earl Mountbatten, the family figure whose 1979 assassination by the Provisional IRA had been one of the most significant institutional traumas of the senior royal family in the years immediately preceding William's birth. The 4 names, taken together, established the institutional framework his identity had been positioned within. He was a future king. He carried the names of previous kings, of mythological royalty, of his paternal grandfather, and of the recently murdered family figure whose death had shaped the senior royal family's subsequent operations. The names were the framework's institutional declaration about what kind of figure he was being asked to become. The household he was born into has been examined in earlier documentaries we have produced about senior royal family members of the period. The marriage of Charles and Diana was, by 1982, already showing the strains that would eventually produce the public collapse a decade later. Charles was 33 at the time of William's birth. Diana was 20. The marriage had been the institutional arrangement that the senior royal family had negotiated. The personal compatibility of the partners had been substantially less than the institutional logic of the arrangement had assumed it would be. The household around the new infant was, from his earliest days, operating under the kind of internal pressures that any reasonable account of the period has had to acknowledge. What this meant for William's earliest years was a household that contained the conventional features of senior royal infant care, alongside the unconventional features that his parents' marriage had been producing. The conventional features included the nanny system, the institutional staff, the careful management of his public exposure across his earliest years. The unconventional features included the parental tensions that were operating in the household as the daily background condition of his upbringing. He was, by every available account from those who observed the family in his earliest years, a child whose parents loved him and were attentive to him in their respective ways. He was also, in the institutional reality of his daily life, a child whose parents' marriage was producing the kind of cumulative pressure that the household had to absorb, in addition to the standard pressures of senior royal infant care. His relationship with his mother across his earliest years was by every available account particularly close. Diana had registered by the time of William's birth the various dimensions of her own institutional position that she found difficult. She had decided in the parenting decisions that her position permitted her to make that she would attempt to provide her children with the kind of warm, engaged maternal presence that her own institutional formation had not always made available to her. She had succeeded by the time of William's early childhood in producing the kind of mother-son bond that has been preserved in the various contemporary accounts of the family. William had received from Diana the warmth that her temperament made available. He had absorbed the warmth in the small daily reality of his earliest years. His relationship with his father was different. Charles, as we have examined in other documentaries about the period, was operating under the institutional pressures of his own position with the kind of preoccupation that his particular character produced. He was not in any practical sense an absent father. He was, however, an emotionally distant one in the dimensions that small children's developmental needs required. The relationship between Charles and William across the early years was correct rather than warm. The institutional codes that Charles had absorbed from his own upbringing, the same codes we examined in earlier documentaries about Queen Mary's framework, had produced in Charles a paternal style that did not include the kind of continuous warm engagement that his children had needed. The differential between his mother and his father was visible by every available account from his earliest years. He registered which parent provided which kind of attention. He registered with the small daily attentiveness that children apply to their immediate environments, the structural fact that his mother was the warmer parent and that his father was the institutional one. The registration would, across his subsequent decades, define many dimensions of how he related to each of them. He would carry across his adult life the foundational maternal warmth that Diana had given him in his earliest years. He would also carry with the same particular weight the institutional formation that his father's framework had imposed on him. The arrival of his younger brother Harry in September 1984 produced the structural change in the household that we examined in the previous documentary. William was 26 months old. He had been the only child for the entire period of his memory. The arrival of the second child produced in his immediate reception of the situation the kind of small accommodation that older children typically have to make when younger siblings arrive. He was no longer the only focus of his parents' attention. He had to share the household's institutional resources with a new figure who had not been there before. The differential structural positions of the two boys, William as the heir, Harry as the spare, would, across their subsequent childhoods, produce the differential institutional pressures that we examined in the previous documentary. William was being prepared for the throne, Harry was not. The framework that operated on William was, in its institutional intensity, substantially different from the framework that operated on Harry. The differential would shape the two brothers' respective developments in ways that have been visible across the entirety of their adult lives. What this meant in the practical reality of William's childhood was that the institutional pressure on him was substantial from his earliest years. He was not, in any sense that mattered for his developmental experience, allowed to be merely a small boy. He was, even in his earliest years, the future king whose preparation had to begin from infancy. The preparation included the small daily institutional features that his position required, the formal exposures to senior figures of state, the ceremonial appearances that his presence had to maintain across the various royal occasions that occurred during his childhood, the gradual exposure to the institutional duties his position would eventually require him to perform. He absorbed these features without producing the kind of resistance that his temperament might, in different family conditions, have produced. He was, by every account from those who observed him during his early childhood, a serious child. He was, by the same accounts, an institutionally compliant one. The framework's logic about what the heir was supposed to become was the logic he was absorbing. The absorption was producing in him the foundational structure that his subsequent adult life would express. His education began at home in the conventional way that senior royal children's early education was conducted. He was taught by Mrs. Minors at Mrs. Minors Nursery School in West London beginning in 1985 when he was 3. He moved to Wetherby School in Notting Hill in 1987. He attended Ludgrove Preparatory School from 1990 to 1995. He went to Eton College from 1995 to 2000. The educational path was the conventional path that the senior royal family had been producing across the decades, the small institutional progression that had produced his father and his grandfather, and the various senior royal figures whose preparation had been the framework's institutional model. What was unusual about his educational path, by the standards of previous senior royal children, was the degree to which his parents, Diana in particular, had insisted that his education include exposure to ordinary aspects of British life that previous senior royal children had been substantially shielded from. Diana had been the figure whose particular insistence had produced these modifications. She had taken William to McDonald's. She had taken him to amusement parks. She had insisted that he be exposed, in small daily ways, to the kind of ordinary British life that her own institutional formation had not provided her with, and that she considered necessary for any future king who would need to operate in the modern democratic Britain her own life had been observing. The insistence had institutional consequences. William developed, across his childhood, the capacity to engage with ordinary British people in ways that his father and his grandfather had not always been able to produce. He absorbed from Diana's parenting decisions the foundational social skills that his eventual public role would require. He learned from the small daily exposures she insisted on that the country he would eventually be king of was not entirely the institutional family network of his official upbringing. The lessons would shape, across his subsequent decades, the kind of senior royal he would become. The institutional pressure on him continued to intensify across his Eton years. He was, by his late adolescence, increasingly aware of the position he would eventually occupy. He was, by every account from those who observed him during the period, registering the various pressures that the position implied, the public scrutiny, the institutional discipline, the personal sacrifices that the framework would require of him across the rest of his life. The registration would produce by the end of his Eton years the foundational psychological architecture that his subsequent adult conduct would express. What also produced this architecture, however, was the catastrophic event that occurred at the midpoint of his Eton years. The death of his mother on the 31st of August 1997 would be the single most significant event of his entire formation. The event had been the subject of the previous documentary's examination from Harry's perspective. From William's perspective, the event would produce different but equally substantial consequences. He was 15 at the time of the death, 3 years older than Harry. The age differential would produce different processing of the trauma. The differential would, in its various dimensions, define some of the foundational differences between how the two brothers would carry the event into their respective adult lives. In the part that follows, we move to the death itself and to the years of his late adolescence that followed it. The years included the institutional response to Diana's death, the funeral, the walk behind the coffin, the years of his Eton continuation in the immediate aftermath, his entry to the University of St Andrews in 2001, where he would meet Catherine Middleton. The years produced the figure who emerged from his late adolescence into the early adulthood that the rest of this documentary will examine. The figure was William as he had been formed by his unique institutional formation, by his mother's death, by the various pressures that his particular childhood had imposed on him. The figure was the figure whose subsequent relationships with the 4 women this documentary has identified would produce the prices each of them paid. The prices began to be paid almost immediately. Diana, his mother, paid the first and most catastrophic price. We turn to her case in the part that follows. He was at Balmoral on the night of the 30th of August 1997, into the early hours of the 31st. He had been at the Scottish royal estate for the family's summer residence period, that had been the conventional senior royal late August arrangement. He was 15 years old. He had been with his father and his younger brother Harry, who was 12, and the various other senior royal family members, whose summer schedules had brought them to the estate. The household had been operating on the conventional Balmoral rhythms that the family had been maintaining across the late summer. The news of the crash reached Balmoral in the early hours. The senior figures of the family, the Queen, Prince Philip, Charles, received the initial reports first. They convened, by various subsequent accounts, in the small institutional meetings that the gravity of the situation required. The decisions about how the boys would be told, when they would be told, who would tell them, were made across the early hours of the morning by the senior figures with the kind of careful consideration that the situation imposed. Charles was the figure who would tell the boys. He would tell them when they woke. He would tell them together. The boys would absorb the news in the conditions that Balmoral provided. The institutional decisions were the framework's standard operations applied to a situation the framework had not been organized to anticipate. Charles told them on the morning of the 31st of August. The exact timing of the conversation has been preserved in the various subsequent accounts, with William's own subsequent recollections in the 2017 documentary Diana, Our Mother, Her Life and Legacy, providing some of the most direct accounts. Charles had come to William's bedroom. He had told William first, before telling Harry. The order had been the institutional one. The heir was told first, the spare was told second. The order would, in retrospect, be one of the small institutional details that William has subsequently noted about how the family had absorbed his mother's death. William's response to the immediate news has been preserved in the various subsequent accounts. He had been, by every available description, devastated. He had also been, almost immediately, registering what the death meant in institutional terms as well as in personal terms. He was the heir of the heir. His mother had been the most photographed woman in the world. The death would produce institutional consequences that the family would have to manage. The 15-year-old boy was registering, even in the immediate aftermath of receiving the news, the institutional dimensions that the death had now imposed on his life. This is the dimension of his response that has distinguished it in retrospective examination from Harry's response. Harry was 12. The institutional dimensions of the death were, for Harry at 12, less immediately accessible than they were for William at 15. William had absorbed, by 15, the institutional formation that his earlier years had been producing. The absorption meant that the death was, for him, immediately legible as an institutional event in addition to a personal catastrophe. The dual legibility would shape his subsequent processing of the event in ways that Harry's processing did not include. The week at Balmoral that followed the death was the period of institutional management we examined in the previous documentary. The senior royal family had decided in the institutional discussions that had occurred in the immediate aftermath that the boys would remain at Balmoral rather than being moved to London. The decision was the framework's institutional response to the situation. The boys would be protected from the press attention that London would have produced. They would be supported by the family network that Balmoral provided. They would be allowed to absorb the death in the kind of private institutional environment that the senior royal family had traditionally provided for moments of family crisis. The decision attracted significant subsequent criticism. The British public, which was experiencing the death as a national event, expected the royal family to be visibly present in London during the period of public mourning. The criticism intensified across the days that followed. By the 4th of September, the public pressure had become substantial enough that the institutional decision to keep the boys at Balmoral was being reassessed. What William experienced at Balmoral across this period has been preserved, in fragments, across his subsequent reflections on the period. He had been, by his own subsequent accounts, supported by the senior figures of the family who were present. The Queen had been particularly engaged with him across this period. Prince Philip had taken him on the long walks across the estate that had been one of the standard mechanisms of grand paternal engagement that Philip had developed across the family's history. The institutional mechanisms had produced, in their cumulative effect, the kind of family support that William had been able to absorb across the difficult days. What the family had not produced, however, was the kind of comprehensive psychological intervention that contemporary understanding of childhood trauma would consider appropriate for a 15-year-old who had just lost his mother. The framework's traditional logic about how royal children were supposed to absorb such events had been the framework's logic. The framework had not been organized to provide professional grief counseling. The framework had been organized to provide family support and institutional continuation. William received the family support and the institutional continuation. He did not receive the professional intervention that, by various subsequent assessments, would have been the more substantial response to what he had absorbed. The senior royal family returned to London on the 4th of September. The Queen produced the televised address to the nation that the institutional moment had come to require. The funeral was held on the 6th of September. The walk behind the coffin we examined in the previous documentary from Harry's perspective. From William's perspective, the walk had been a different experience. He was 15, he was the heir. He had been required to participate in the procession in the institutional capacity that his position imposed on him. By Earl Spencer's subsequent recollection, William had not wanted to walk. He had been substantially reluctant. The reluctance had been overcome in the institutional discussions that had occurred between the family and Earl Spencer in the days before the funeral by the various pressures that those discussions had produced. Prince Philip had been the figure who had specifically encouraged the walk. He had told the boys that he would walk with them. The encouragement had produced the institutional decision that the boys would participate. William had complied. His subsequent reflection on the walk, in the 2017 documentary, captured something of what he had experienced. He had described the walk as one of the hardest things he had ever done. He had described in the small specific details his memory had preserved the experience of walking the long mile while the country watched. He had described his determination not to break down in front of the cameras. He had described the institutional discipline he had been required to apply to himself across the duration of the walk. What this revealed about William in retrospective examination was the institutional formation that had produced him by 15. He had absorbed by that point in his development the institutional codes that required senior royal figures to maintain composure under pressure. He had applied the codes to the moment of his mother's funeral. The application had produced the visible composure that the country had observed. The composure had been in itself an institutional achievement that the framework had been organized to produce. The cost of the composure was the cost that William has carried into his subsequent decades, the cumulative effect of having absorbed at 15 the institutional codes about how grief was to be publicly performed by senior royal sons. What also developed in William across this period was the foundational hostility toward the British tabloid press that he has carried into his adult life. The hostility was different from Harry's hostility, more controlled, more institutionally channeled, less visible in its public expressions, but no less substantial in its underlying intensity. William, like Harry, identified the British tabloid press as the institutional figure whose conduct had contributed to his mother's death. The photographers who had been pursuing the Mercedes through the streets of Paris had been the immediate proximate figures. The broader tabloid culture that had produced the conditions in which the pursuit had become standard practice had been the systemic figure. William registered both. He has carried the registration across his subsequent adult life. The carrying has produced in his subsequent institutional posture the kind of disciplined hostility that has shaped many dimensions of his relationship with the press. He has been across his adult life less willing to engage with the British tabloid press than his father had been. He has been in his various interactions with the press more institutionally formal than the warmer engagement that previous senior royal generations had sometimes maintained. The hostility has been one of the foundational features of his adult institutional posture. It had its origins in the period we are now examining. The years that followed Diana's death produced the continuation of his Eton education. He returned to school within weeks of the funeral. The school had been modified by various institutional accommodations to provide him with the additional support that the period required. The modifications had been substantially private. The school had not produced public statements about how William's situation would be managed. The institutional response had been conducted through the small daily mechanisms that Eton's culture made available. He completed his Eton education in 2000. He took a gap year that included travel to Chile, where he worked with the Raleigh International Voluntary Organization. The gap year was the conventional path that British upper-class young men of his class took before university. The travel to Chile was somewhat less conventional. The work involved actual hands-on engagement with educational and conservation projects that required physical labor and direct interaction with people from substantially different backgrounds than William had encountered in his previous experiences. The work has been preserved in the various subsequent accounts as one of the formative experiences of his early adulthood. He had emerged from the experience with a different kind of confidence than his Eton years had produced. He had registered across the period of the gap year that he could function adequately outside the institutional structures that had been organizing his life. He entered the University of St Andrews in 2001. The choice of St Andrews had been, by various accounts, the institutional decision that had been made in consultation with the senior royal family. The university was prestigious enough to suit his position. It was located in Scotland, which provided the kind of geographic distance from London that the family had decided would be beneficial for his university years. It was substantially smaller than the larger British universities, which permitted the kind of institutional management of his presence that the senior royal family considered appropriate. He entered the institution as a student of art history, though he would later transfer to geography. What St Andrews would also produce, across his time as a student there, was the meeting that would shape the next dimension of his life. He met Catherine Middleton at St Andrews. The meeting was approximately the time of his arrival at the university. They were both first-year students. They lived in the same hall of residence. They were, in their initial interactions, friends rather than romantic partners. The friendship would develop, across the years that followed, into the relationship that this documentary will examine in the parts ahead. The figure who arrived at St Andrews in September 2001 was the figure that his late adolescence had produced. He was 19 years old. He had absorbed his mother's death 4 years earlier. He had completed his Eton education with the institutional discipline that his position had required. He had taken his gap year. He was now beginning the university experience that the framework had organized for him. He was also, by every available account, a young man whose formation had produced specific temperamental features that would, across his subsequent adult life, become more visible. He was institutionally serious. He was, by various accounts of those who observed him in his St Andrews years, at times moody in ways that his closer friends registered. He was in his social engagement more reserved than the warmer presentation his mother had encouraged him to develop in his earlier childhood. The reserve had been in some sense the protective layer that his mother's death had imposed on him. He had developed across the 4 years between 15 and 19 the kind of institutional self-protection that his particular trauma had required. The self-protection would shape his subsequent relationships in various ways. What this would mean for Catherine Middleton, when their friendship developed into a romantic relationship across his second and third years at St Andrews, was that she would be entering a relationship with a figure whose particular psychological architecture had specific features that she would have to absorb. He was the future king. He was the heir whose institutional formation had been organized around his eventual succession. He was also the young man whose mother's death 4 years earlier had produced the specific temperamental features that would, across the years of their relationship and their eventual marriage, define many dimensions of how he would operate as a partner. Catherine entered the relationship without, by any available account, having fully registered the institutional weight of what she was entering. She was an upper-middle-class British young woman whose family background had not included senior royal preparation. She was charming, intelligent, capable. She was not, in any sense that her upbringing had prepared her for, the kind of figure whose previous formation had organized her for the position she would eventually occupy. The position would, across the years of her relationship with William, be one she would have to learn through direct experience of its pressures. What this part has been examining is the figure William had become by the time he entered St Andrews. The figure was William as his late adolescence had produced him. The figure included the institutional formation, the absorbed grief, the disciplined hostility toward the press, the foundational psychological architecture that his particular early experience had imposed on him. The figure was the figure who would, across the years that followed, develop the relationship with Catherine Middleton that this documentary will examine across the parts ahead. The relationship would produce, across the years of its development, the various dimensions of the figure who emerged from it. The relationship would also produce, across the same years, the cumulative pressures on Catherine that would constitute the second of the 4 prices this documentary has identified. Diana had paid the first price. Catherine would pay the second. The price was being paid even before the relationship had become public, in the small daily reality of what she had begun to absorb across her years at St Andrews with William. In the part that follows, we move to the relationship itself. The years at St Andrews, the 2003 transition from friendship to romance, the graduation in 2005 and the subsequent years of public courtship that produced, in the British tabloids of the period, the nickname Waity Katie, the 2007 breakup, the reconciliation, the October 2010 engagement, the April 2011 wedding. The 8 years that Catherine waited for William's commitment to materialize into formal engagement, and what those 8 years revealed about the institutional approach to commitment that William had developed across his particular formation. Because the 8 years of waiting were the 8 years that Catherine paid for, in different forms across the various dimensions of her young adult life. The British press paid attention. The institutional position she occupied was, across the period, substantially uncertain. The framework that William was operating within did not produce, until he was ready, the institutional resolution that her position required for the kind of stable life she was attempting to construct. The framework produced what the framework produced. Catherine absorbed what she had to absorb. The next part will examine the absorption. She arrived at St Andrews in September 2001 with the kind of conventional preparation that British upper-middle-class young women of her generation typically had. She had been born on the 9th of January 1982 in Reading, Berkshire, 5 months and 12 days before William. Her parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, were both products of British middle-class backgrounds, whose successful family business, Party Pieces, the mail-order party supplies company they had founded in 1987, had produced the kind of substantial economic resources that allowed them to send their 3 children to private schools and to provide them with the kind of upper-middle-class adolescent life that the British class system permitted. Her education had included Marlborough College, the prestigious co-educational boarding school where she had completed her A-levels with academic results that qualified her for university admission to St Andrews. The school had been the institutional context in which she had developed many of the social skills that her later life would require. She had been, by every account from her contemporaries at Marlborough, popular, athletic, and conventionally successful in ways that did not produce the kind of distinctive presentation that some of her later critics would attempt to attach to her. She had been, in the language her contemporaries used about her, a nice girl from a reasonably well-off family who had done reasonably well at school. What she had not been, in the institutional categorization the British aristocratic system applied to such matters, was the kind of figure whose family background made her institutionally suitable for the eventual position she would occupy. The Middletons were not aristocrats. Michael Middleton's family had included some moderately distinguished ancestors. Carol Middleton's family had included her own grandfather, who had been a coal miner, a fact that William's well-heeled friends would, by various accounts from the period of the courtship, use to dismiss the Middleton family in ways that Catherine herself would absorb across the years of her relationship with William. The catchphrase the friends had reportedly applied to Carol, "doors to manual," referring to her former career as a flight attendant, had been preserved across the documentary record as one of the small institutional details about how the senior aristocratic class had received the Middleton family's elevation. Catherine entered St Andrews knowing she would be at the university with William since his attendance had been publicly announced before her arrival. She had not, by every available account, organized her presence at the university around his presence in any deliberate sense. She had attended St Andrews because the university's reputation for art history had attracted her, though she would, like William, eventually transfer to a different program. She and William were placed in the same hall of residence, St Salvator's Hall, which had been the kind of institutional accommodation that the university had organized for first-year students. They met across the early weeks of their first year. The relationship was, in its initial form, friendship rather than romance. They saw each other in the small daily contexts that the hall of residence produced: meals in the dining hall, social events in the common areas, the various small interactions that university students of their year were having with each other. William was, by every account, particularly relieved by Catherine's response to his presence. She had not behaved in their interactions with the kind of star-struck deference that he had received from many other students at the university. She had treated him as a fellow student. The treatment had been the particular thing he had been hoping to find at university, the chance to be briefly a person rather than only a position. Catherine had provided the experience. The friendship developed across their first and second years. By their second year they were sharing a flat with 2 other friends, Fergus Boyd and Olivia Bleasdale. The flat-sharing arrangement was the conventional second-year accommodation that St Andrews students typically adopted. The arrangement would, across the year that followed, be the institutional environment in which the friendship between William and Catherine developed into something else. The transition from friendship to romance has been preserved in fragments across the various subsequent accounts. The most documented single moment was the charity fashion show held at St Andrews in March 2002, in which Catherine had appeared in a transparent dress that William had reportedly seen with the kind of registration that produced his subsequent active interest in her as something more than a friend. The moment was, in the various subsequent retellings, the kind of small specific event that captures larger transitions in such relationships. The relationship developed across the months that followed. By the spring of 2003 they were romantically involved. The romantic involvement was, in its early years, conducted with substantial discretion. The British tabloid press had not yet identified Catherine as William's romantic partner. The friendship period that had preceded the romance had served to disguise the transition. They were, across their later years at St Andrews, conducting their relationship in the kind of small private conditions that university romantic relationships typically permitted. The discretion would not last beyond their graduation. But across the years at St Andrews itself, the relationship had been able to develop in conditions that subsequent stages of their lives would not provide. They graduated from St Andrews in June 2005. Both received their degrees. The graduation produced in its institutional dimensions the moment at which their relationship would begin the public phase that would define the next stage of their lives. William was now 23. Catherine was 23. They had been together in some form for approximately 4 years. The institutional question of what would happen next began to be asked. The conventional answer that the British public expected was the answer that their relationship's duration suggested. They had been together for 4 years. They had completed their education. The next stage, by the logic that British upper-class courtships of the period typically followed, was engagement. The engagement would produce in due course the wedding. The wedding would produce in due course the children that the institutional position required. The conventional answer was not the answer that the relationship produced. Across the years that followed graduation, William did not propose. The non-proposal would, across the years that followed, become one of the foundational facts about the relationship that the British tabloid press would document with the kind of sustained attention that the situation produced. The years between 2005 and 2010 were the years that the Waity Katie framing referred to. The framing had been produced by the British tabloids across the period as Catherine waited, with the kind of patient persistence her temperament had been formed to produce, for William's commitment to materialize. The framing was, in its operational reality, a substantially humiliating one. Catherine was being publicly described as a young woman whose primary occupation was waiting for a man to commit to her. The framing reduced her to a passive figure whose own life was being defined by the absence of a decision someone else had not yet made. What Catherine was actually doing across the years between 2005 and 2010 was substantially more than the framing acknowledged. She was working, first at Jigsaw, the British clothing retailer, and subsequently for her family's party pieces business. She was attending the various social events that her position required. She was developing, across the period, the kind of public presentation that her eventual senior royal role would require. She was, in the practical reality of her daily life, building the foundation for the position she would eventually occupy. The framing did not capture this. The framing captured only the absence of the engagement. The absence was being treated by the British tabloids as the central fact about her life. The framing was institutionally damaging. Various royal correspondents have preserved, across the subsequent years, the documentary record of how the Queen herself had reportedly registered Catherine's situation with concern. By various accounts, the Queen had concluded that Catherine was not doing enough, that she appeared to be operating without the kind of substantive professional work that the modern senior royal expectations required. Royal commentator Phil Dampier was preserved in the documentary record as having noted that during the 8 years Middleton dated William before their engagement, she appeared to be doing very little. A palace source by various accounts told the Daily Mail that Elizabeth was furious with Kate because she was simply lazy, and that the palace had pressured her to find a proper job and not wait idly for William's proposal. The institutional pressure on Catherine across this period was therefore substantial. She was being publicly dismissed by the British tabloids. She was being privately criticised by senior figures of the family she was hoping to marry into. She was, in the practical reality of her daily life, operating under cumulative pressures that her upbringing had not prepared her to absorb at this scale. What William was doing across the same period was conducting the kind of post-university life that British upper-class young men of his class typically conducted. He had completed his St Andrews education. He had begun his military training. He attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst from January 2006 to December 2006, graduating as a second lieutenant in the Blues and Royals. He had then begun his various military service rotations across the years that followed. He had been in the institutional logic of his preparation for his eventual senior royal role, doing the work the framework had organized for him. He had also been, by various accounts from the period, conducting his social life in ways that produced the kind of cumulative tensions in the relationship with Catherine that would eventually lead to the 2007 breakup. He had been seen at various social events without Catherine. He had been photographed at nightclubs, at country parties, at the various social occasions that his peer group was attending. The British tabloids had documented his social life with the kind of attention that produced regular content for their royal coverage. The cumulative effect across the period of late 2006 and early 2007 was the development in Catherine of the kind of doubt about William's commitment that her continuing patience had been able to absorb until it could not. The breakup occurred in April 2007. The exact circumstances have been preserved in fragments across the various accounts. The most direct documentation of the period suggested that William had been in his own institutional accounting, not yet ready for the engagement that the relationship's logic required. He had reportedly told Catherine that he wanted the life of a bachelor while serving in the military. The framing was the institutional framing of someone who had decided that the freedoms of his late 20s were not yet to be relinquished for the institutional requirements of senior royal marriage. He had communicated the decision to Catherine. The communication had produced the breakup. What the breakup revealed about William in retrospective examination was specific. He had absorbed, by 2007, the institutional formation that his position had imposed on him across his earlier years. He had also developed in his own subsequent reaction to that formation a particular sense that the institutional commitments his position required of him were not commitments he was yet ready to make. The sense had produced the resistance to the engagement that his relationship with Catherine had been progressing toward. The resistance was, in its operational reality, the institutional pressure on him manifesting as relational hesitation. Catherine paid the cost of the resistance. The breakup was, in the British tabloid coverage that immediately followed it, presented as William having ended a relationship in which Catherine had been the more committed partner. The framing was the framing the tabloids had been developing across the previous years. The breakup confirmed the framing. The Waity Katie who had been waiting for the engagement was now the woman who had waited too long, who had not received the commitment, who had been left by the future king when his institutional position had not allowed him to commit. What Catherine did across the months that followed has been preserved in the various subsequent accounts. She produced by every available description the kind of disciplined response to the breakup that revealed her own psychological resources. She did not collapse publicly. She did not attempt to recover William through any of the various small mechanisms that other women in her position might have attempted. She returned to work. She traveled with her family. She attended social events. She conducted, across the period of the separation, the kind of visibly composed life that demonstrated to William, to the British public and to herself that she was capable of operating without him. The strategy worked. The British public responded positively to her response. The British press began, across the months that followed the breakup, to register her as a figure whose institutional dignity was substantial. The shift was visible in the coverage. The Catherine of late 2007, by the time of her quiet reconciliation with William in the autumn of that year, was a figure whose public position had been substantially modified by the way she had absorbed the breakup. She was no longer just Waity Katie. She was the woman who had been left and had emerged with her dignity intact. The modification had institutional consequences that would shape the rest of the relationship. The reconciliation was conducted privately across the second half of 2007. The British public did not register the reconciliation immediately. The tabloid coverage continued, across the months of late 2007 and into 2008, to discuss the relationship as if it remained ended. The actual reality, conducted in private, was that William and Catherine were operating again as a couple. The discretion of the reconciliation was in some institutional sense a feature of the new dynamic that the breakup had produced. They had separated, they had reconciled. The reconciliation was being conducted with the institutional caution that the previous breakup had produced. What the reconciliation did not immediately produce was the engagement that the British tabloids continued to expect. Across 2008, 2009, and the early months of 2010, William and Catherine continued in the relationship without the formal commitment that her position required. The Waity Katie framing continued to operate, modified by the breakup and reconciliation but not eliminated by it. Catherine was now in her late 20s. She had been in the relationship with William in some form for nearly 9 years. The continued absence of the engagement was producing by 2010 the kind of cumulative institutional pressure that even the modified post-2007 framing could not fully accommodate. The Queen's reported displeasure with Catherine's situation continued across this period. The royal correspondent Katie Nicholl preserved in the documentary record one of the small private moments of the period, Carol Middleton's own concern about her daughter's situation by Christmas 2009. "I know that it was the Christmas of 2009 when Carol was getting quite concerned," Nicholl told Vanity Fair. Kate was nearing 30, there was still no ring on her finger. The maternal concern was the small private indication that Catherine's situation had reached the kind of cumulative pressure that even her own family was beginning to find difficult to accept. The engagement came in October 2010. William had proposed to Catherine in Kenya during a private holiday with the engagement ring that had belonged to his mother, the sapphire and diamond ring that Diana had received from Charles in 1981. The proposal had occurred at Lake Ratundu, a remote location near Mount Kenya. The proposal was the institutional resolution that the previous 9 years of the relationship had been working toward. The announcement of the engagement was made on the 16th of November 2010. The British public response was substantial. The Waity Katie who had been waiting was finally to be the future Queen Catherine. The framing transformed across the moment of the announcement. The patient woman who had absorbed the years of public scrutiny was being institutionally rewarded for her patience. The transformation was the framing the British public had been waiting to apply, and the engagement permitted the application. The wedding occurred on the 29th of April 2011 at Westminster Abbey. The wedding was watched by an estimated global audience of 2 billion. Catherine became Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Cambridge. The institutional position she had been working toward for nearly a decade had now been formally achieved. What the 8 years of waiting had produced in retrospective examination was substantial. Catherine had absorbed the cumulative pressures of the period. She had emerged with the kind of institutional discipline that the position would require. She had also absorbed, in dimensions that have been less examined, the foundational understanding that her partner was a figure whose institutional position would always come before the personal dimensions of their relationship. The understanding would shape, across the years of the marriage that followed, many dimensions of how she operated as William's wife. The marriage would produce 3 children. The marriage would produce the public family life that the British public has watched across the subsequent 15 years. The marriage would also produce, in dimensions this documentary will examine in the parts ahead, the more complicated reality that the long wait had foreshadowed. William's institutional formation had not been substantially modified by the marriage. The features that had produced the 8-year wait would, in different forms, continue to operate across the marriage. Catherine would continue across the years that followed to absorb what the framework imposed. In the part that follows, we move to the marriage itself, the early years, the births of the 3 children, the institutional life Catherine entered, the pressures that the position imposed on her, the various complications that have been documented across the years of the marriage, the temperamental features that William has carried into the marriage and that Catherine has absorbed in the small daily reality of their life together, the marriage that by every external measure has been substantially successful, and that has, in the documented dimensions this documentary will examine, also been the institutional environment in which the second of the 4 prices has continued to be paid. The marriage began on the 29th of April 2011. The first 6 months were conducted with the kind of institutional management that senior royal newlyweds typically experienced. The couple had been provided with Nottingham Cottage on the grounds of Kensington Palace as their initial residence, the same small two-bedroom property that Harry and Meghan would later occupy in the early period of their own marriage. The cottage was, by the standards of senior royal accommodation, modest. It had been the institutional choice that William and Catherine had reportedly preferred. They had wanted, in the early period of the marriage, the kind of small private living conditions that would allow them to develop their daily routines without the elaborate household infrastructure that larger residences would have required. What also continued, across this initial period, was William's military service. He had been a search and rescue pilot for the Royal Air Force since 2010. The position was based at RAF Valley on the island of Anglesey in North Wales. Catherine had moved with William to Anglesey in the early period after their marriage. The household at Anglesey was, by every account from those who observed the couple during this period, the smallest and most private living arrangement they would ever have. They lived in a rented farmhouse. They did much of their own cooking. They conducted, across the 18 months they were based in Anglesey, the kind of small daily life that approximated the experience of an ordinary professional couple in their late 20s. This period has been, in retrospective examination, one of the more consistently positive periods of the marriage that the available documentary record contains. William and Catherine were operating across their Anglesey months in conditions that the institutional pressures of senior royal life had not yet fully imposed on them. They were young, they were newly married. They were managing the early conditions of their relationship in geographic distance from the senior royal household structures that would later substantially organize their daily life. The Anglesey period was, by every available account, a successful one for the marriage. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. What followed the Anglesey period was the gradual transition into the more substantial institutional engagement that William's position would eventually require. He completed his RAF search and rescue service in September 2013. The transition produced the institutional decision that William and Catherine would relocate to London, where they would take up the senior royal duties that their position required. The household at Kensington Palace, apartment 1A, which had been substantially renovated for them across the previous 2 years, would be their primary residence going forward. The institutional life that the marriage had been preparing for would now be the daily reality. Prince George had been born on the 22nd of July 2013, while William was still completing his RAF service. The birth was the institutional event that the senior royal family had been preparing for since the announcement of the pregnancy. George's birth was the third in line to the throne. The institutional weight of the moment was substantial. The country had received the news with the kind of national attention that senior royal births of this kind had typically produced. Catherine had given birth at the Lindo wing of St. Mary's Hospital, the same wing where William himself had been born 31 years earlier. The early period of George's infancy coincided with the relocation to London. Catherine was now operating as the mother of the future king while simultaneously managing the transition into the more substantial public role that her senior royal position required. The dual demands were significant. The senior royal family had organized institutional support for her: staff, advisors, the various figures whose roles included managing the daily logistical reality of her position. The support was substantial. The pressures, however, were also substantial. Catherine was learning in real time the institutional discipline that her position required. Princess Charlotte was born on the 2nd of May 2015. The institutional reception was conventional, the second royal child, the addition to the family that the institution had been hoping for. The framework's continued operations confirming that William and Catherine were performing the institutional duties their position required. Prince Louis was born on the 23rd of April 2018. The third child completed the family that William and Catherine had reportedly always intended to have. The institutional position of the couple as the senior royal family of the next generation had been substantially confirmed. What this institutional reality produced for Catherine, across the years between 2013 and the present, has been a kind of working life that the British public has substantially observed, but whose internal dynamics have been less visible. She has been, by every external measure, an institutionally successful senior royal woman. She has been popular with the British public. She has performed the various duties her position requires with the kind of brisk, competent dignity that the framework demands. She has been in the polling that has been conducted across her time as a senior royal, one of the most popular members of the family. What the polling has not captured, however, is the daily reality of operating inside the household William headed. The reality has been documented across various sources, including Tom Quinn's 2024 book Yes Ma'am, The Secret Life of Royal Servants, which drew on interviews with dozens of former staff members across multiple royal households. The book preserved, in fragments, accounts from former staff who had served in the William and Catherine household across the years following the marriage. The accounts identified specific features of the working environment that the household had produced. William, by various of these accounts, was a demanding employer. The demanding character was different from the kind of overt difficulty that some other senior royals had produced, different from Andrew's documented bullying, different from Anne's brisk impatience that we examined in earlier documentaries. William's demanding character was more controlled, more institutionally disciplined, but no less substantial in its operational effect on the staff who worked for him. He had high standards. He expected the standards to be met. He registered failures with the kind of disappointed sharpness that staff who had served him have described as substantially more difficult to absorb than louder forms of displeasure. The character had specific features. William was by various accounts particularly impatient with what he considered institutional incompetence. He had absorbed, across his upbringing, the institutional codes about how senior royal households should operate. He applied the codes with the kind of consistency that did not provide much accommodation for staff whose particular performance fell short of his expectations. The framework's institutional discipline had been imposed on him across his formation. He was, in his adult life, applying the same institutional discipline to the staff whose work supported his daily operations. What this produced for staff who could not meet William's standards was, by various accounts, the kind of professional difficulty that royal household service produced. They left, they transitioned. The household at Kensington Palace, across the years of William and Catherine's marriage, has been the kind of working environment whose staff turnover at certain levels has been higher than what the institutional ideal of long-serving royal staff would have produced. The pattern has not been unique to William's household. Comparable patterns have operated in other senior royal households we examined in earlier documentaries. The pattern has been, however, present in his household at the levels that the available documentation has been able to identify. Catherine has been operating inside this household environment. She has been the senior royal woman who has, in the practical reality of her daily life, had to manage the institutional dynamics that William's temperamental features have produced. The management has been substantial. She has, by every account from those who have observed the couple at close range, become the figure who has often softened the institutional environment that William has produced. She has been the warmer presence. She has been the figure whom staff have, in many accounts, identified as the institutional figure whose engagement with the household has compensated for the colder dimensions of William's own engagement. This had institutional consequences that have shaped many dimensions of how the household has functioned. Catherine has been doing institutional work that her position has not formally required of her. She has been managing William's temperamental features alongside her own substantive senior royal duties. She has been compensating in the daily reality of the household's operations for what her husband's particular character has produced. The compensation has been the kind of unacknowledged labor that women in senior institutional positions have historically been required to perform alongside their formal duties. Catherine has performed it. The performance has not been substantially registered in the public coverage of her senior royal life. What this part of the documentary is examining is the dimension of Catherine's marriage that the public version of her senior royal role has not made visible. The public version has been the version the institutional management has produced, the warm Duchess of Cambridge, then the warm Princess of Wales, the figure whose marriage to the future king has appeared, in every external measure, to be one of the most successful senior royal marriages of the modern period. The version is real. The version is also, in the dimensions this part has been examining, incomplete. The cumulative effect of operating inside the household William headed has been substantial for Catherine. The various accounts that have emerged across the years have identified specific moments where the cumulative pressure has been visible. The 2019 BBC Berry Royal Christmas special preserved one such moment. Viewers had registered, in a segment of the broadcast, what appeared to be Catherine pushing William's hand away from her shoulder during a public appearance. The moment was small. It was also, in the cumulative context of the period, registered by various subsequent observers as the kind of small public manifestation that revealed pressures that the public version of the marriage had been substantially concealing. The period of 2019 was also the period during which the Rose Hanbury rumours began to emerge in the British media. The rumours will be the subject of the part that follows this one. The relevant fact for the current part is that the rumours emerged during the period when various other indicators of pressure in the marriage had become visible to careful observers. The rumours did not by themselves establish that any specific institutional dynamic had occurred. They did indicate that the public version of the marriage had been operating alongside dimensions that the institutional management had not been substantially able to conceal. What also occurred during this period, across 2018 and into 2019, was the emergence of the bullying allegations against Meghan Markle that we will examine in detail in Part 6. The allegations had been filed through Kensington Palace's HR mechanisms in October 2018. They had not been publicly disclosed at that point. The internal institutional response, however, had been substantial. The historian Robert Lacey has preserved in his book Battle of Brothers, William and Harry, the inside story of a family in tumult, the documentary record of how William had absorbed the allegations. The Lacey account included specific language about William's response. William had been, by Lacey's account, astonished and horrified when he first learned of the bullying allegations from the Kensington Palace communications chief Jason Knauf. The allegations had implicated Meghan in the mistreatment of staff William had personally liked. William's response, by Lacey's account, had been substantial. He had gone ballistic on hearing the dossier of allegations. He had instructed his private secretary, Simon Case, to begin dividing the William, Catherine and Harry Meghan households immediately. The institutional rupture between the two brothers' households had been formally initiated by William's response to the bullying allegations. What this revealed about William's institutional response patterns was specific. He had absorbed across his formation the institutional codes about how senior royal households should treat their staff. The codes were strict. The codes had been the framework's foundation across generations. William's grandmother had taught him, by Lacey's account, to treat staff like family. Meghan's alleged conduct had violated the codes substantially. William's response had been the institutional response that the codes required: formal, decisive, immediate. The response had also been characterized as going ballistic. The characterization was preserved in Lacey's documentation as the specific framing his sources had used about William's reaction. The framing was the framing that the documentary record contains. William had not produced a quiet, measured institutional response. He had produced an explosive one. The explosion had been registered by those around him with sufficient intensity that the framing of going ballistic had attached to the moment in the subsequent reconstruction of the period. This is the dimension of William's temperamental features that has been most consistently documented across the various sources that have examined him. He has produced in moments of institutional stress the kind of explosive responses that exceed the more controlled institutional discipline he typically maintains. The explosive responses have been the moments where the cumulative pressure of his particular formation has manifested in ways that the framework's standard management has not been able to fully contain. The going ballistic of October 2018. The red mist Harry would describe in the 2019 Nottingham Cottage incident we will examine in Part 7. The various smaller incidents that have been preserved across the documentary record. The pattern is the pattern of a figure whose institutional control is substantial but not absolute, whose temperamental features have produced specific moments of failure across the years. Catherine has been operating inside the household where these features have been operating. She has been William's wife across the period when the documented incidents have occurred. She has been, in the practical reality of her daily life, the figure who has had to absorb what William's temperamental features have produced when they have produced it. The absorbing has been substantial. The absorbing has been part of the price she has paid across the marriage. What the marriage has also produced, however, has been the substantial public success that the institutional version of the marriage has been able to maintain. William and Catherine have been, by every external measure, one of the most popular senior royal couples in modern British history. The 3 children have been substantially well adjusted by every available account. The institutional duties have been performed at the level the framework requires. The marriage has been, in the dimensions that the institutional version captures, successful. Both pictures are real. The institutional success is real. The temperamental complications are real. Catherine has been operating inside both pictures simultaneously across the years of the marriage. She has been the popular Princess of Wales. She has also been the woman whose husband's particular formation has produced the working environment she has had to manage in the daily reality of their household. The dual reality has been her experience. The experience has been the second of the 4 prices this documentary has identified. The cancer diagnosis of Catherine in early 2024 produced the moment at which her institutional position became the subject of international concern in ways the previous decade had not produced. She had been absent from public engagements for several months across late 2023 and into early 2024. The absence had produced the kind of conspiracy theories that we will examine in the part that follows, theories that had attached themselves to the Rose Hanbury rumours and had produced the wave of conspiracy speculation that dominated the international media in March 2024. The cancer announcement had then been produced, in the video message Catherine herself recorded, as the institutional response to the cumulative speculation. She had cancer. She had been undergoing treatment. The absence had been medical rather than the various theories that had been speculating about it. The cancer treatment was substantially completed by early 2025. Catherine returned to public duties across the year. She has been, in the period of this documentary's preparation, operating again in the senior royal capacity that her position requires. The cancer episode has been preserved in the documentary record as one of the most substantial personal challenges of her senior royal life. The episode has also revealed dimensions of how the institutional management of her position has operated. The privacy that the cancer diagnosis required had been managed by Kensington Palace with the kind of careful institutional discretion that the framework's standard practices produced. The privacy had also produced the conspiracy theories that the absence of information had permitted to develop. The institutional balance had been complicated. The balance had been managed. In the part that follows, we move to the third of the 4 women this documentary has identified. Rose Hanbury, Marchioness of Cholmondeley. The 2019 emergence of the affair rumours, the British media's coverage of the alleged falling out between Catherine and Hanbury, the Giles Corran tweet that had circulated the rumours, the legal response from William's lawyers that had produced, across the years that followed, the systematic removal of stories about the rumours from British media outlets, the Vulture investigation in 2024 that documented the removal, the Stephen Colbert reference in March 2024 that brought the rumours back into mainstream attention, Hanbury's denial through her lawyers in March 2024. The rumours are completely false. The case that this documentary will examine in its specific dimensions as the third of the 4 prices paid. This part of the documentary requires particular care in how it handles the available evidence. The case it examines is the case of a woman whose name became attached, in 2019, to William in ways that the public record cannot definitively resolve. The available evidence does not establish that an affair occurred between William and Rose Hanbury. The available evidence also does not establish that no affair occurred. The evidence establishes specific things about how the rumours were managed, how British media outlets responded to legal pressure, and how Hanbury herself eventually responded through her lawyers. These are the documented dimensions. The documented dimensions are what this part will examine. Rose Hanbury was born Sarah Rose Hanbury on the 15th of March 1984. Her family background placed her within the small, interconnected world of the British aristocracy. Her maternal grandmother, Lady Elizabeth Lambert, had been one of the bridesmaids at the November 1947 wedding of Queen Elizabeth II to Prince Philip. Her sister Marina married Earl Mountbatten's grandson, Lord Edward Pelham Clinton. Her family had been operating across the generations in the social circles that intersected with the senior royal family at multiple points. She had worked as a model in her early adulthood. She had not pursued the kind of aggressive career trajectory that some of her contemporaries had pursued. She had, by 2009, married David Roxovich, the 7th Marquess of Cholmondeley, the British peer whose family seat was at Houghton Hall in Norfolk. The marriage had produced 3 children, twin sons Alexander and Oliver, born in 2009, and a daughter Iris, born in 2016. The Marquess was 23 years older than Rose. The marriage had, by every available account from those who knew the family, been substantially successful across the years that followed. What the marriage had also produced was the geographic positioning that would eventually place Rose Hanbury in proximity to William and Catherine. William and Catherine had purchased Anmere Hall in 2013, the property on the Sandringham estate that Queen Elizabeth had given them as a wedding gift. Anmere Hall and Holton Hall were approximately a 40-minute drive apart. Both households were in the institutional structure of the Norfolk aristocratic community, part of the same small social network. The Colmandales and the Cambridges had been, across the years that followed William and Catherine's relocation to Anmere Hall, part of the same social circle. The social circle had a name in the British media that subsequently emerged: the Turnip Toffs. The framing the British tabloids had produced for the small group of aristocratic families who occupied the Norfolk countryside and who maintained, across the period, the kind of close mutual social engagement that aristocratic communities of their kind had traditionally maintained. William and Catherine had been part of the network. The Colmandales had been part of the network. The two families had socialized together at various points across the years between 2013 and 2018. Rose Hanbury and Catherine had been, by every available account from the period, friends. What was alleged to have happened beginning in 2019 was that the friendship between Catherine and Rose Hanbury had ended. The first publicly documented account of the falling out appeared in March 2019 in The Sun. The article, written by royal correspondent Dan Wooten, reported that Catherine had asked William to phase out Rose Hanbury and her husband from the couple's social circle. The article suggested that the relationship between the two women had deteriorated to the point that Catherine had reached out to William's institutional staff to manage the social separation. The article did not explicitly state that an affair had occurred. The framing of the article, however, suggested that something significant had happened between Rose and the Cambridge household that had produced the rupture. What followed, in the days after the Sun's article, was the brief period during which various other British media outlets attempted to develop the story further. Tatler magazine produced its own reporting on the falling out. The Mail on Sunday produced material that referenced the controversy. The British tabloid coverage was, for several days in March 2019, sustained. What also occurred during this period was the response from William's institutional position. William's lawyers, by various subsequent accounts the firm Harbottle and Lewis, which has historically represented senior royals in such matters, issued legal warnings to the British media outlets that had been reporting on the rumours. The warnings were the institutional response that the framework's standard practices produced when senior royal figures faced press allegations they considered unacceptable. The warnings included, by various subsequent accounts, references to defamation law, privacy law, and the various other legal mechanisms that British media outlets considered when deciding whether to continue with stories that produced legal pressure. The British media outlets responded by modifying their coverage. The specific framings that had referenced the alleged affair were softened. The headlines that had been produced were modified. The stories that had been published were, in some cases, removed entirely from the websites of the outlets that had originally produced them. The Vulture investigation that we will examine shortly documented the systematic character of these modifications across the British media environment. The modifications were not, in their operational reality, the standard editorial revisions that journalism produces in the normal course of business. The modifications were the specific institutional responses to the legal pressure that William's lawyers had produced. What had also occurred, however, was a moment in March 2019 that had escaped the institutional management. The journalist Giles Corran, a Times columnist who was also, by various accounts, a friend of Meghan Markle, had produced a tweet that had referenced the alleged affair directly. The tweet had been posted on the 4th of April 2019. The tweet had been quickly deleted by Corran. Corran had subsequently characterized the tweet as a joke. The tweet had been, however, screenshotted before deletion, and the screenshots had circulated across social media in ways that the deletion could not retract. The Corran tweet had specific institutional consequences. It had documented in the public record that the alleged affair was being discussed by figures within the British media establishment, with the kind of casual reference that suggested the rumours had been circulating in British media circles before the public reporting had produced them. The tweet had not by itself established that the affair had occurred. The tweet had established that the rumours had been operating in private British media discussions before they had become public. What followed across the months and years between April 2019 and March 2024 was the period during which the institutional management of the rumours operated successfully. The British media coverage of the alleged affair substantially diminished after the initial March-April 2019 period. The rumours continued to circulate in social media and in the international press, but the British outlets had substantially complied with the legal pressure that William's lawyers had produced. The rumours became, across this period, the kind of story that British media outlets did not actively pursue. The institutional management had worked. What had also been operating, across this period, was the systematic modification of the historical record that British media outlets had produced about the rumours during the original 2019 period. The Vulture investigation, published in March 2024 by royal correspondent Ellie Hall, documented this dimension. Hall's investigation had reviewed the historical archives of multiple British media outlets and had identified specific articles about the alleged affair that had been removed from the outlets' websites or had been substantially modified across the years between 2019 and 2024. The investigation's findings were substantial. Hall identified articles in The Sun, the Daily Mail, Tatler, The Express, and various other British outlets that had originally been published in 2019 and had subsequently been deleted, edited, or modified in ways that removed references to the alleged affair. Hall also documented that the original versions of these articles remained accessible through the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, which had preserved the pre-modification versions of the articles. The Wayback Machine archive permitted retrospective comparison of the original articles and the modified versions. What the comparison revealed was specific. The British media coverage of the 2019 rumours had originally included specific framings that referenced the alleged affair, the alleged falling out between Catherine and Rose Hanbury, the alleged tensions in the William-Catherine marriage that the rumours had implied. The modified versions had in many cases removed these framings entirely. The modified versions had often replaced the original framings with more neutral language about the social circle that had previously included the Colmandellis. The modifications had been the institutional response to the legal pressure that William's lawyers had produced across the years. What this had produced in the British public's access to information about the rumours was a specific kind of historical record manipulation. British readers attempting to research the 2019 rumours would by 2024 find substantially different material than what had been available in 2019. The original framings had been substantially removed. The modified framings had become the official historical record. The institutional management had operated across 5 years to produce a documentary record that substantially favoured William's institutional position over the original journalism that had emerged in 2019. The Vulture investigation noted specifically that the only publication that had explicitly addressed Hall's questions about the modifications was The Guardian. The Guardian had told Vulture that it had adjusted one of its stories after internal editorial consideration and not following external outreach. The other publications, Kensington Palace, the British outlets that had modified their coverage, representatives for Hanbury, had not provided direct responses to Hall's investigation. The lack of responses had, in itself, been the institutional silence that the framework's traditional management produced. What brought the Hanbury rumours back into mainstream international attention was the period of Catherine's medical absence in early 2024. Catherine had undergone abdominal surgery on the 16th of January 2024. The surgery had been disclosed publicly by Kensington Palace in a brief statement. The recovery period had been characterized as expected to extend through the spring of 2024. Catherine's absence from public engagements across this period had been substantially extended. What had also been operating during this period was the institutional silence about the specific nature of Catherine's medical condition. Kensington Palace had not, in its initial communications about the surgery, disclosed the specific medical issue that had required the procedure. The privacy was the institutional decision that Catherine and William had made in consultation with the palace's communications staff. The privacy was, in itself, defensible. Catherine's medical condition was her private medical information. She was entitled to manage the disclosure of her medical information through whatever institutional mechanisms she preferred. The privacy, however, produced the conditions in which the conspiracy theories that had been associated with the Hanbury rumours could re-emerge with substantial force. The Kate-spiracy framing began to develop across social media in the early months of 2024. The framing combined several different threads: speculation about Catherine's medical condition, references to the 2019 Hanbury rumours, the absence of regular public confirmation of Catherine's well-being, various other features that the institutional silence had permitted to develop. The conspiracy theories were not in any operational sense supported by evidence. They were, however, operating in the absence of the substantive information that institutional disclosure would have provided. The international media response to the conspiracy theories produced the moment at which the Hanbury rumours became the subject of mainstream international attention again. Stephen Colbert, on the 12th of March 2024, had produced an opening monologue on The Late Show that had referenced the rumours directly. The reference was preserved in the documentary record. "I think we all know who the alleged other woman is. Say it with me, the Marchioness of Cholmondeley. Now there have been rumours of an affair between William and Hanbury since 2019. The Colbert monologue had specific institutional consequences. It had brought the rumours back into mainstream international media attention with sufficient force that the previous 5 years of institutional management could not contain them. The rumours had been, until that point, substantially confined to social media speculation and to the international media outlets that had not been subject to the legal pressures that British outlets had absorbed. The Colbert reference had pushed the rumours into the kind of mainstream visibility that institutional management had been organised to prevent. What followed was the response from Hanbury's lawyers. The response was preserved in Business Insider's reporting in March 2024. Hanbury's lawyers told Business Insider that the rumours are completely false. The statement was the first time Hanbury had publicly addressed the rumours. The statement was, in its institutional dimensions, substantial. Hanbury was, across the years between 2019 and 2024, denying that the affair had occurred. Kensington Palace had also been asked by Business Insider to address the rumours. Kensington Palace declined to comment. The decline was the institutional response that the framework had been producing across the years since 2019. The palace did not deny the rumours. The palace did not confirm them. The palace produced no statement about whether the alleged affair had occurred. The institutional silence continued. What had been produced across the period this part has been examining was the kind of complicated documentary record that the available evidence does not allow definitive resolution of. The rumours had emerged in 2019. The British media had reported them. The legal pressure had been applied. The British media had modified their coverage. The historical record had been substantially altered. The conspiracy theories had re-emerged in 2024. Hanbury had denied the rumours through her lawyers. Kensington Palace had maintained institutional silence throughout the period. William himself had not produced any direct public statement about the rumours. The available evidence had been the available evidence that this part has examined. What the available evidence does establish, regardless of what actually occurred between William and Rose Hanbury, is that the institutional response to the rumours had been substantial. The legal pressure on British media outlets had produced the systematic modification of the historical record. The institutional silence had produced the conditions in which the rumours could not be substantively examined through the conventional mechanisms of journalism. The pressure had been, in operational reality, the institutional protection of William's reputation that the framework had been organised to produce when senior royal figures faced allegations they considered unacceptable. What this revealed about the framework, in retrospective examination, was specific. The framework's institutional protection mechanisms had operated successfully. William's reputation had been substantially protected. The rumours had been substantially contained. The historical record had been substantially modified. The institutional position of William had been preserved. The framework had produced what the framework had been organized to produce. What had been less protected, however, was Hanbury herself. The institutional protection of William had not extended to Hanbury in equivalent measure. She had been the woman whose name had been attached to the rumours. She had been the figure whose social position had been substantially affected by the cumulative coverage. She had been required eventually to deny the rumours publicly in ways that produced the kind of personal exposure that her institutional position had not been organized to absorb. Whether or not the affair had occurred, the cumulative effect of the rumours and the institutional response to them had imposed substantial costs on her that she had not in any institutional sense chosen to absorb. This is the dimension of the case that the title of this documentary refers to as one of the 4 prices paid. The price Hanbury paid was the price of having her name attached to William in conditions she had not invited and could not by herself control. The institutional response to the rumours had protected William. The institutional response had not protected Hanbury. She had been the woman whose name became the subject of speculation that her own institutional position had no equivalent mechanism to address. She had been required to absorb the speculation across 5 years of British and international media coverage. She had been required eventually to break her own silence through her lawyers in March 2024. The price was real. The price was paid. Whether or not the affair had occurred, the institutional dynamics around the rumours had produced the cumulative cost that Hanbury had absorbed. The cost was the cost that the framework's institutional protection of William had imposed on the woman whose name had been attached to him in conditions she had not by herself been able to manage. In the part that follows, we move to the 4th of the 4 women this documentary has identified: Meghan Markle. The 2016 introduction to the family. The institutional reception. William's documented response, including the going ballistic of October 2018 that we examined briefly in the previous part. The instruction to divide the households immediately. The cumulative role William played in the institutional rupture that produced the January 2020 stepping back of Harry and Meghan from senior royal duties. The 4th price paid by the 4th woman in the pattern this documentary has been examining. The 4th woman entered the framework's institutional environment in the autumn of 2016. She was 35 years old. She was the American actress whose relationship with Harry had been confirmed in November 2016 through the Kensington Palace statement that we examined in the previous documentary about Harry. The statement had been the institutional acknowledgement that Harry and Meghan were in a relationship. The statement had also included the unusual condemnation of the British tabloid press for what Harry had characterized as the racial undertones of its coverage of Meghan. The statement was the first publicly visible institutional moment of what would, across the next 4 years, become the substantial institutional rupture that this part will examine. What this part will not do is recapitulate the entirety of Meghan's case that the previous documentary examined from Harry's perspective. The Oprah interview, the racism allegations, the bullying allegations against Meghan that Kensington Palace investigated, the cumulative pattern of the rupture. These have been examined. What this part will examine is the specific dimension of the case that involves William directly, the role he played in the institutional response, the documented features of his reaction to Meghan's presence in the family, the cumulative effect of his particular institutional posture on the woman who had married his brother, and on the rupture that her presence eventually produced. The relationship between William and Meghan in its early phase was conducted through the conventional mechanisms that senior royal sibling-in-law relationships typically operated through. William and Catherine had met Meghan by various accounts in the early period of her relationship with Harry. The initial meetings had been conducted in the kind of small private settings that the family used for such introductions. The meetings had been, by every available account from the period, cordial. William had not, in the early months of the relationship, produced any of the documented difficulties that would emerge later. The institutional reception had been conventional. What had begun to change, across the period between the initial meetings and the May 2018 wedding, was the cumulative institutional response that the framework's standard mechanisms produced when complications emerged. The complications had specific features. The British tabloid press, as we examined in the documentary about Harry, had produced coverage of Meghan that included substantial racial framings. The framings had not been confined to the tabloid press alone. Various dimensions of British public discourse had absorbed the framings. Meghan was operating, across the period of her engagement and the early months of her marriage, in conditions that had not been imposed on previous senior royal partners in equivalent measure. What William's response to these conditions revealed has been documented across multiple sources. The most substantial single piece of documentation is the work of historian Robert Lacey, whose 2020 book Battle of Brothers, William and Harry, The Inside Story of a Family in Tumult, drew on interviews with figures across the senior royal household and produced an account of the period that has been substantially treated as authoritative by subsequent royal correspondents. Lacey's account included specific documentation of William's role in the various institutional moments that the period produced. The first specific moment Lacey documented was William's reported intervention with Harry before the November 2017 engagement. By Lacey's account, William had asked Harry in a private conversation whether Harry was sure about Meghan. The question had been, by Lacey's framing, the kind of brotherly intervention that William had considered appropriate. Harry's subsequent response, preserved in his own spare memoir in 2023, had been substantially less charitable about the question than Lacey's framing suggested. Harry had registered the question as the kind of institutional skepticism that revealed William's underlying reservations about Meghan's suitability for senior royal life. The reading is contested. The available evidence does not allow definitive resolution of which version is closer to what occurred. The reading of "Are you sure?" as appropriate brotherly concern is the reading William's institutional position would prefer. The reading of "Are you sure?" as institutional skepticism that revealed underlying reservations is the reading Harry produced in his memoir. Both readings could be partially accurate. The conversation in its actual character may have included dimensions of both. The question itself, regardless of how it was intended, became one of the early moments in the cumulative pattern that defined William's relationship with Meghan. The wedding occurred on the 19th of May 2018. William served as Harry's best man. The institutional performance of the wedding was, by every external account, successful. The family had appeared. The institutional unity had been displayed. The cumulative tensions that had been operating in the period before the wedding were not visible in the wedding's public dimensions. The institutional management had produced the kind of public moment that the framework's traditional practices were organized to produce. What had also occurred, however, in the period immediately before the wedding, was an incident that has been preserved in the documentary record and that captured something specific about how the institutional dynamics around the wedding had operated. The incident concerned Princess Charlotte's bridesmaid dress. The fitting for the bridesmaids' dresses had occurred in the days before the wedding. Catherine had attended the fitting with Princess Charlotte. By various accounts that emerged across the subsequent years, Charlotte's dress had not fit properly during the fitting. The dress had required adjustment. The conversation about the adjustment had occurred between Catherine and Meghan. The conversation had been, by every subsequent account, difficult. The accounts diverged significantly on what actually occurred during the conversation. The version that initially emerged in the British tabloid press in November 2018 was the version that Meghan had made Catherine cry during the fitting. The framing was preserved in coverage by the Daily Telegraph and various other British outlets. The framing positioned Meghan as the figure whose conduct had been institutionally inappropriate. The framing produced, in the subsequent British public discourse, the kind of cumulative perception that contributed to Meghan's developing reputation as Duchess difficult. The version Meghan produced in the March 2021 Oprah interview was the inverse version. Meghan had stated in the interview that the actual occurrence had been Catherine making Meghan cry, not the other way around. Meghan had also stated that Catherine had subsequently apologized and brought flowers and a note. The reversal was substantial. The institutional response from Kensington Palace to Meghan's version had been characteristically no response at all. Catherine had not produced a public statement either confirming or denying Meghan's version. The institutional silence had been the framework's standard response. What the case revealed was specific. The original British tabloid framing, "Meghan made Catherine cry," had been institutionally amplified across multiple outlets in late 2018. The framing had become, by the time of the Oprah interview in March 2021, one of the foundational items in the public assessment of Meghan that British discourse had produced. The framing had originated through institutional channels that had subsequently been documented as having produced systematic briefings against Meghan across the period. The framing had not in any institutional sense been corrected when Meghan produced her own contrary version. The institutional dynamics had favored the original framing's continuation rather than its correction. What had also been operating across the period between the wedding and the eventual rupture was the specific institutional response from William to the developing situation. The most substantial single moment of his response by Lacey's documentation was the October 2018 incident concerning the bullying allegations against Meghan. The allegations had been filed by Jason Knauf, the Kensington Palace Communications Secretary, on the 10th of October 2018. Knauf had filed the allegations through formal channels within the palace's HR mechanisms. The allegations specifically claimed that Meghan had bullied 2 members of staff out of the household across the previous year. The treatment of the staff by Knauf's documented characterization had been totally unacceptable. The allegations had been preserved in the institutional record, though they had not been publicly disclosed at the time of their filing. William's response to the allegations by Lacey's account had been the response we examined briefly in Part 4. William had been, by Lacey's framing, astonished and horrified when he first learned of the allegations from Knauf. He had been particularly affected because he had personally liked the staff members alleged to have been mistreated. He had absorbed the allegations as institutional violations of the codes his grandmother had taught him about treating staff like family. His response by Lacey's continuing account had been substantial. He had gone ballistic upon hearing the dossier of allegations. He had instructed his private secretary Simon Case to begin dividing the William, Catherine and Harry Meghan households immediately. The instruction had been the institutional decision that produced the formal organizational separation of the 2 households across the period that followed. What this revealed about William's institutional response patterns was specific. He had, on hearing the allegations against Meghan, made the institutional decision that the previous structure of the joint households was no longer viable. The decision had been made within hours or days of his receipt of the allegations. The decision had been made without, by any available account, substantial deliberation about whether the allegations were accurate. The decision had been made on the basis of the allegations themselves rather than on the basis of any concluded institutional process about whether the allegations had been substantively confirmed. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. The decision was characteristic. William had absorbed, across his institutional formation, the codes about how senior royal households should treat their staff. The codes had been the framework's foundation across generations. He had registered the allegations as substantive violations of the codes. He had produced the institutional response that the codes required. The response had been formal, decisive, and immediate. Whether the response was proportionate to what had actually occurred is a different question. The bullying allegations against Meghan have been the subject of substantial subsequent investigation. The investigation was conducted by Buckingham Palace through external lawyers across 2021 and 2022. The findings of the investigation were not publicly disclosed. The palace had announced that the investigation had been completed and that policies had been updated, but had declined to release the substantive findings. The institutional decision to maintain confidentiality had been in itself the kind of management practice that prevented definitive resolution of whether the bullying had occurred. What the available evidence has established is that some former staff members produced accounts that supported the bullying allegations. Other former staff members produced accounts that disputed them or that provided context that complicated them. Meghan herself has consistently denied the allegations. The truth in retrospective examination has not been definitively resolved. The institutional management has produced the conditions in which definitive resolution has not been possible. What is documented, regardless of the resolution of the underlying allegations, is William's response. He had registered the allegations as substantive. He had produced the institutional response. The response had included the formal separation of the households. The separation had been the institutional foundation for the developing rupture between the 2 brothers and their respective households. What followed, across the period between the October 2018 separation and the January 2020 stepping back, was the cumulative deterioration of the relationship between the 2 brothers' households that we examined briefly in the previous documentary. The deterioration had specific features that William's role in had been substantial. He had, by various accounts, become increasingly skeptical that the structures of senior royal life would be sustainable for Meghan. He had registered by various accounts that the institutional culture he had absorbed from his upbringing was not the culture that Meghan was prepared to absorb in equivalent forms. He had concluded across the period that the rupture was probably inevitable. The conclusion was, by various accounts, registered with the kind of institutional resignation that has been preserved across the documentary record. William had not, by any account, attempted to substantively prevent the rupture in the period leading up to it. He had rather accepted the rupture as the institutional outcome that the cumulative dynamics had produced. His acceptance had been the institutional acknowledgement that Meghan's presence in the family was no longer something the framework's standard mechanisms could absorb. What had also been operating across the same period was the specific institutional moment in November 2019 that we will examine in Part 7. The moment was the alleged altercation at Nottingham Cottage that Harry has documented in Spare. The altercation had been, by Harry's account, the moment at which the cumulative tensions between the two brothers had produced the specific physical confrontation that Harry has alleged occurred. The alleged altercation, regardless of its specific details, occurred in the period when William's institutional response to Meghan's presence had been substantially operating. The cumulative environment in which the alleged altercation occurred was the environment that William's institutional response had contributed to producing. The Sandringham Summit on the 13th of January 2020 was the institutional event that finalized the formal terms of the rupture. The summit had been called after the announcement on the 8th of January that Harry and Meghan would be stepping back from senior royal duties. The institutional response to the announcement had been substantial. The senior figures of the family, the Queen, Charles, William, Harry, had convened at Sandringham to determine what the new arrangement would actually look like in operational terms. William's role in the summit, by various subsequent accounts, had been substantial. He had been in the institutional discussions the figure whose position had favored the more decisive separation that the summit eventually produced. The framework that had emerged from the summit included Harry and Meghan's removal from their working senior royal roles, the removal of their use of the HRH styles in any working capacity, and the formal organizational separation that institutionalized the rupture. What this had produced across the period that followed was the formal exclusion of Meghan from the institutional structures of the British royal family that her marriage had introduced her into. She had been, by January 2020, no longer a working senior royal. She had been operating, across the years that followed, as a former senior royal whose institutional position had been substantially modified by the rupture. The price Meghan paid in this dimension was specific. She had been the figure whose presence in the family had produced, across the cumulative period from late 2016 to January 2020, the institutional response that William's particular position and institutional formation had organized. The institutional response had been hostile. The hostility had been produced not by Meghan's underlying character but by the cumulative dynamics that William's particular institutional response had contributed to. The dynamics had not in any sense been the dynamics that Meghan herself had been able to substantially modify. The price was real. The price was paid. The cumulative institutional response that William had produced had contributed to the conditions that had produced the rupture and that had imposed on Meghan the kind of departure from senior royal life that her marriage had not been organized to produce when it had begun in 2018. What this part has been examining is the specific dimension of William's role in the cumulative rupture. The dimension is real. The dimension exists alongside the various other dimensions that the documentary record has preserved. Meghan's own conduct, the bullying allegations that the institutional process has not definitively resolved, the British tabloid press's substantial role in producing the conditions Meghan had to absorb. The various dimensions had operated together. William's role had been one dimension among several. The role had been, however, substantial enough to constitute the fourth of the four prices this documentary has been examining. Meghan continues in her California life to operate outside the institutional structures of the British royal family. The two children, Archie and Lilibet, are being raised in California. The institutional connection has been substantially attenuated. What has not been substantially attenuated is the cumulative effect that the period between 2016 and 2020 produced on Meghan's understanding of the institution she had married into. She has been, across the years that followed, substantially clear in her public statements about the institutional dynamics she experienced during her time as a working royal. The clarity has produced the kind of public commentary that the framework's traditional silences have not been organized to absorb. What this had revealed about the framework's institutional management of senior royal partners had been substantial. The framework had been organized across generations to absorb the partners that senior royal sons married. The absorption had been in the framework's traditional logic, the institutional outcome the partnership produced. Meghan had not been absorbed. The framework had failed to produce the outcome with her. The failure had been in part the result of Meghan's own institutional resistance to absorption that her particular character had produced. The failure had also been, in significant part, the institutional response that William's particular position had contributed to producing. The cumulative failure had been, across the period, the institutional event that the framework had not been organized to anticipate. The framework had absorbed previous senior royal partners through various forms of institutional discipline. The framework had not absorbed Meghan. The non-absorption had produced the rupture. The rupture had imposed the cumulative cost on Meghan that this part has been examining. In the part that follows, we move to the specific incident that the title of this documentary refers to in its second clause, the Nottingham Cottage altercation of 2019. Harry's account in Spare, the red mist that Harry described. The complete public silence from Kensington Palace about the allegation across the years since 2023. The dimension of this case that revealed more starkly than any other single incident this documentary has examined, the temperamental features that William's institutional formation had produced and that the framework had been substantially organized to keep contained. The next part will examine that specific incident and what it revealed. The incident occurred at Nottingham Cottage in 2019. The exact date has not been preserved in the public record. Harry's account in Spare, when he eventually published it in January 2023, located the incident in the period of the cumulative tensions we have been examining across the previous parts of this documentary. The bullying allegations against Meghan had been filed in October 2018. The institutional separation of the households had been initiated by William's instruction to Simon Case. The cumulative pressures between the two brothers had been operating across the months that followed. The alleged incident at Nottingham Cottage occurred somewhere within this broader period. What occurred between William and Harry, by Harry's account, can be reconstructed from the Spare description. We examined the description briefly in the previous documentary about Harry. We will examine it again here from William's perspective, with the specific attention to what the documented account reveals, and the careful registration of the limits of that documentation, given that Kensington Palace has, across the years since the publication, declined to address the allegations. By Harry's account, William had arrived at Nottingham Cottage. The arrival had not been social. William had come to address what Harry has characterized as the whole rolling catastrophe of the brothers' relationship. Harry's framing of William's state on arrival was specific. William had been, by Harry's framing, piping hot, the framing suggesting that William had arrived in the kind of agitated condition that the cumulative period had produced. The conversation that followed had been, by Harry's account, an unproductive one. The two brothers had begun their exchange with the kind of mutually frustrated statements that the cumulative period had been organizing them to produce. William had characterized Meghan, by Harry's account, as difficult, rude and abrasive, the framings that we examined in Part 6 as institutionally significant for what they revealed about William's developed institutional assessment of Meghan. Harry had registered the framings as the institutional repetition of the press narrative about Meghan that had been operating in the British tabloids since 2016. The conversation had escalated. The two brothers had moved from the initial exchange into the kind of mutual shouting that Harry's account preserved. The exchange had progressed, by Harry's reconstruction, from the kitchen of the small cottage into the physical confrontation that Harry has alleged occurred. Harry had offered William water. William had taken it. At a specific point that Harry's Spare account locates with precision, William had set down the water, called Harry another name. Harry does not specify what name in the memoir, and came at him. The physical incident that Harry has alleged occurred has been preserved in the spare text with specific reconstruction. Harry's description in the memoir reads, "He grabbed me by the collar, ripping my necklace, and he knocked me to the floor. I landed on the dog's bowl, which cracked under my back, the pieces cutting into me." What followed, by Harry's account, was a moment in which Harry had remained on the floor while William had stood over him. Harry has described, in his various subsequent interviews about the incident, the specific reaction that he produced in the moment. He had not, by his own account, fought back. He had registered in the small moment of the confrontation what he characterized as the red mist in William, the moment of agitation that Harry has identified as the specific feature of William's response that produced the physical confrontation. Harry has framed his decision not to fight back as the institutional discipline that his own therapy had been producing. He had absorbed the moment without escalating it. What Harry has also described in his subsequent interviews about the incident was William's response after the immediate confrontation. William had, by Harry's account, registered what had occurred and had attempted to mitigate it. William had stated, by Harry's reconstruction, "I didn't attack you, Harold." The statement had been, by Harry's framing, the institutional self-distancing that William's particular character had produced when registering what had just occurred. The statement was preserved by Harry as one of the more specific dimensions of the alleged incident's aftermath. This is the account that Harry produced. The account has been the principal source of public information about the alleged incident across the years since Spare was published in January 2023. The account has not been, in the years since publication, substantively challenged by any institutional response from Kensington Palace. The Palace has, across the period, maintained the institutional silence that we have been characterizing as the framework's standard response to allegations the institution has decided not to address. What has, however, occurred has been the production of contrary accounts from various figures who have served the family. The most significant of these has been the response of Grant Harold, the former butler who had served Charles for 7 years across the period when William and Harry were both substantially present at Highgrove. Harold has, in interviews across the period since Spare was published, produced the kind of direct denial of the alleged altercation that contradicted Harry's account. Harold's account, preserved in his interview with the British outlet Teela in September 2025, was specific. He said, "I never witnessed them have a fight." He continued, "I can guarantee you right now that I never saw a fight break out, a punch-up occur, or a shouting match take place between William and Harry. If it did, you'd know about it, because Highgrove isn't that big. If you shouted, someone would hear you." Harold went on, "So Harry saying William knocked him to the ground, I just don't believe it. William hasn't got that in him. That's not him. I find the whole thing bizarre." The Harold account has substantial limitations as a contradiction of Harry's account. Harold had served at Highgrove. The alleged Nottingham Cottage incident had occurred, by Harry's specific framing, at Nottingham Cottage on the grounds of Kensington Palace. Harold would not in any direct sense have witnessed an incident at Kensington Palace. Harold's contrary account is therefore not the direct contradiction of Harry's specific allegation that it might appear at first reading. Harold's contrary account is a contradiction of the broader implication that William was the kind of figure whose temperamental features included physical confrontation with his brother. The contradiction is, in operational terms, the kind of character defense that figures who served the family in the relevant period have been producing across the years since Spare. What this dimension of the documentary record reveals is specific. The alleged incident at Nottingham Cottage has not been definitively confirmed or denied. The available evidence permits the conclusion that something had occurred between William and Harry in the period in question. The available evidence does not permit definitive resolution of whether the specific physical features Harry has alleged actually occurred. The incident remains in the documentary record, the contested allegation that Harry has produced, and that the broader institutional response has neither confirmed nor substantively denied. What is documented, regardless of the specific factual character of the alleged incident, is the institutional response from Kensington Palace. The Palace has produced, across the years since the publication of Spare, no public statement about the alleged incident. The Palace has not denied the allegation. The Palace has not confirmed it. The palace has produced, across more than 2.5 years, the kind of complete institutional silence that the framework's traditional management practices have organized for allegations the institution has decided not to address. This silence is the institutional dimension that the title of this documentary refers to in its second clause. The burying the title characterizes is, in its most direct sense, the silence that the institutional response has produced. The palace had been organized across generations to manage internal family conflicts through the production of institutional silence rather than through the production of substantive public engagement. The mechanism was applied to the Nottingham Cottage allegation. The silence was the response. The silence has continued. What has, however, also operated across the period since Spare was published has been the cumulative documentary record that has continued to develop independently of the institutional silence. Harry has continued to produce public statements about the alleged incident. Various royal correspondents and biographers have produced their own accounts, some supporting Harry's framing, and some producing contrary accounts. The cumulative effect has been the continuing development of the historical record about the period, regardless of the institutional silence that Kensington Palace has maintained. The publication of Spare in January 2023 has been the principal moment in this cumulative development. The memoir was, as we examined in the documentary about Harry, the substantial commercial and cultural event that the period produced. The memoir's contents had included the various dimensions of the alleged Nottingham Cottage incident. The memoir's promotional interviews had included Harry's direct statements about the incident across various international media outlets. The cumulative public exposure had been substantial. What this had revealed about William's institutional position was specific. He had been the figure whose institutional silence had been organized around. The silence was the response. The silence had been institutionally maintained across the immediate period of the publication. The silence had produced the specific institutional outcome the framework had been organized to produce. The absence of any direct engagement that would have permitted the alleged incident to be definitively addressed. What had also been operating across the period was the cumulative deterioration of the relationship between the two brothers. The deterioration had specific features that have been documented across the years since the publication. Harry and William had not, by every available account, substantively communicated outside the institutional contexts that the family's continuing operations had required. The communication that had occurred had been by various accounts conducted through institutional channels rather than directly. The relationship had been, in operational terms, terminated. The termination has been one of the most significant institutional features of the post-Spare period. William and Harry had been, across their childhood and early adulthood, substantially close brothers. The closeness had been documented across the various dimensions of the family's life. The closeness had not, in any subsequent sense, been preserved across the cumulative tensions of the period between 2016 and 2023. The two brothers who had walked behind their mother's coffin in September 1997 were now, by every available account, operating in the kind of substantial estrangement that family ruptures of this magnitude typically produce. The death of Queen Elizabeth in September 2022 had produced one of the few subsequent moments at which the two brothers had been required to be in substantial physical proximity. The funeral arrangements had required their joint presence at various ceremonies. The institutional unity had been performed. The unity had not, by every available account from the period, been the kind of substantive reconciliation that the family had been hoping for. The performance had been the institutional one. The substance had not been modified. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being born into greatness that isn't quite yours. Not the loneliness of poverty or invisibility or being forgotten by the world, but the loneliness of standing close enough to the throne to feel its heat, yet never quite sitting on it, close enough to the crown to understand its weight, yet never expected to wear it. It is a strange, gilded kind of isolation, and it shaped Lady Davina Windsor in ways that the public rarely saw and the palace never fully acknowledged. Davina Elizabeth Maud Windsor was born on November 19, 1977. Her father was Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a quiet, architectural-minded royal who had never expected to hold his title at all. Richard had been the younger son, the one allowed to pursue a normal career, to live something resembling an ordinary life. But when his elder brother Prince William of Gloucester died tragically in a plane crash in 1972, Richard was pulled back into the institution he had been quietly drifting away from. He inherited the dukedom, he accepted the duty, and 5 years later Davina was born into that world. A world that had been reshaped by loss before she ever drew her first breath. Her mother, Birgit van Deurs, was Danish-born, a woman who had married into the royal family with grace and quiet dignity. Together, Richard and Birgit raised their children, Davina, her elder brother Alexander, and younger sister Rose, in a household that was royal by name but relatively modest by the standards of the Windsor family's inner circle. They lived at Kensington Palace, yes, but not in the grand, spotlight-soaked apartments associated with the monarchy's most famous faces. Their corner of that world was quieter, more private, less theatrical, and yet the institution was always present. It showed up in the expectations that surrounded every birthday, every public appearance, every photograph taken at a family gathering. It showed up in the unspoken understanding of what was acceptable and what was not. What kind of life a girl with Windsor blood was supposed to want, supposed to pursue, supposed to become. Davina grew up watching the monarchy from a unique vantage point. She was close enough to Queen Elizabeth II to understand the woman behind the crown, the sharp intelligence, the iron discipline, the genuine warmth that existed beneath the formal exterior. Her grandmother was not a distant figurehead to Davina, she was family. Real, present, complicated family. But family, in the Windsor sense, always came wrapped in institution, and the institution had rules that ran deeper than any individual relationship, deeper than affection, deeper than blood. Rules about appearances, rules about choices, rules about who was worthy and who was not. As a child, Davina was described by those who knew her as bright and warm, someone with a naturalness that stood out even in rooms full of carefully practiced composure. She was not the kind of girl who seemed to be performing royalty. She simply lived inside it, observing it, absorbing it, and quietly, privately, beginning to question it. She attended St. George's School in Windsor, then later Stowe School in Buckinghamshire, where she mixed with peers from wealthy and well-connected backgrounds. She was never the most prominent Windsor, never the one the cameras chased most hungrily. That, in a strange way, gave her a kind of freedom that the more visible royals never had. She could breathe slightly more easily, move slightly more freely. But freedom inside the palace world is always relative, and Davina Windsor would spend the first decades of her life discovering exactly where its limits lay, not through rebellion, not through scandal, but through something far simpler and far more dangerous to the institution than either. She would discover it through love. There is a term used quietly in royal circles, rarely spoken aloud but understood by everyone who moves within them. Minor royal. It sounds almost dismissive, and in many ways it is meant to be. It is the monarchy's way of drawing an invisible but ironclad line between those who truly matter to the institution and those who simply exist within its orbit. Those who are central to the succession, to the pageantry, to the public-facing story of the crown, and those who are close enough to be bound by its rules, but not important enough to be fully protected by its privileges. What had also occurred, across the period since Spare was published, was the diagnosis of King Charles's cancer in early 2024. The diagnosis had produced the brief institutional moment of attempted reconciliation that we examined in the documentary about Harry. Harry had travelled to London. He had spent approximately 30 minutes with Charles. He had returned to California. The visit had not produced any substantive modification of the relationship between Harry and William. William had not, by any available account, been substantially involved in Harry's brief visit to his father. What this revealed about William's continuing institutional posture toward Harry was specific. He had absorbed, across the years since Spare was published, the institutional decision that the relationship with Harry was no longer the relationship he was prepared to actively maintain. The absorption was the framework's standard response to family figures who had departed from institutional discipline. The institutional discipline that William had absorbed across his formation was the discipline that his response to Harry had been organized around. The discipline did not include substantive accommodation for figures who had produced the kind of public allegations that Spare had contained. The continuing institutional silence from Kensington Palace about the Nottingham Cottage allegation has been, across the period of this documentary's preparation, the most consistent institutional feature of the case. The palace has not, in any moment that has been preserved in the public record, addressed the allegation. The silence has been the response. The silence has continued. What this had revealed about the framework's broader institutional management capacity was specific. The framework had been organized across generations to absorb internal family conflicts through institutional silence. The mechanism had operated successfully across many previous family conflicts. The mechanism had been applied to the Nottingham Cottage allegation. The mechanism had operated in its standard institutional way to produce the absence of direct engagement that the framework's traditional logic had organized for such allegations. The mechanism had also, however, been operating in conditions that the contemporary information environment had substantially modified. The institutional silence had been the framework's standard response. The information environment of the 2020s had not been the information environment of previous decades. The silence had operated alongside the active commercial and cultural distribution of Harry's spare memoir, the various international media outlets that had reported on the allegations, the cumulative public discourse that had developed around the case across the years since the publication. The silence had been the institutional response. The silence had not, however, been the entirety of the documentary record. The record had continued to develop independently of the silence. The cumulative effect, in retrospective examination, has been the kind of complicated historical record that the title of this documentary refers to. The information about the alleged incident is now substantially in the public domain, preserved in spare, in Harry's various subsequent interviews, in the secondary reporting that has accumulated across the years. The institutional silence has not erased the information. The silence has, however, produced the specific institutional outcome that Kensington Palace has not been required to engage with the allegations directly. The institutional protection of William's position has been substantially maintained. The cost of the maintenance has been the absence of the institutional accountability that direct engagement with the allegations would have produced. This is the structural fact that the title of this documentary refers to. The burying has been the institutional silence. The silence has been the response. The response has produced the institutional outcome. The information has continued to circulate independently of the institutional response. The cumulative pattern has been visible to careful observers regardless of the silence. The silence has been, however, the institutional response that the framework had been organized to produce. The silence has continued. What the cumulative record now contains is the kind of contested allegation that has been substantially preserved in the public domain alongside the institutional silence about it. The allegation is on the record. The allegation has not been institutionally addressed. The allegation has been, in operational terms, the kind of unresolved historical claim that subsequent generations of historians and biographers will continue to examine without producing the kind of definitive resolution that direct institutional engagement might have permitted. What this part has been examining is the specific case in which William's temperamental features, whatever their actual character, produced the kind of allegation that the institutional management has been substantially organized to keep contained. The containment has succeeded in operational terms. The containment has not eliminated the allegation. The allegation continues to be part of the public record. The institutional silence continues to be the institutional response. In the final part of this documentary, we move to the contemporary situation, the current institutional position of William as Prince of Wales, the continuing institutional management of the four cases this documentary has examined, the closing meditation on what the cumulative pattern has revealed across the four women whose lives have intersected with William's, the price each of them paid, the figure at the center of the prices, the framework that produced him and that continues to produce across the conditions of his current life as the heir presumptive to the British throne, the institutional dynamics that the cumulative pattern has been examining. Because William is, as of the date of this documentary's preparation, the figure whose succession will in due course occur. He will at some point in the years ahead become King William V of the United Kingdom. The framework that has produced him will at that point be operated by him. The questions about what kind of king he will become, questions that the cumulative pattern this documentary has examined has organized, will be answered across the reign that follows. The next part will examine the contemporary moment that precedes the eventual succession. He is 43 years old. He is the Prince of Wales. He has occupied that position since the 9th of September 2022, the day after Queen Elizabeth II's death and his father's accession to the throne. The position is the institutional confirmation that his eventual succession is the next institutional event the framework is preparing for. He will at some point in the years ahead, the precise timing dependent on factors that nobody has yet been able to specify, become King William V of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The current institutional moment is, in this sense, the period of his preparation. The position of Prince of Wales has, across the centuries, been the institutional preparation period for figures whose eventual accession was substantially confirmed. His father had occupied the position for 64 years before his accession. William's occupation of it is unlikely to extend across an equivalent period. Charles, by various assessments preserved across the medical disclosures of his cancer treatment, has been managing the kind of health situation whose specific trajectory has not been fully publicly disclosed, but whose institutional implications have been the subject of substantial private consideration within the family. William's accession may be, in operational terms, substantially closer than his father's accession had been at the equivalent point. The household at Kensington Palace continues to operate as the institutional centre of his current position. Catherine, Princess of Wales, continues to be the figure whose institutional partnership with William has been the foundation of his daily life across the years of his marriage. The three children, George, Charlotte and Louis, continue to be raised inside the institutional structures that William and Catherine have organised for them. The institutional life of the family has been, across the period since Catherine's cancer recovery in 2024 and 2025, substantially restored to the working operations that the position requires. What has continued, across the same period, has been the institutional management of the various dimensions this documentary has examined. The Hanbury rumours have continued to be substantially contained through the institutional response that we examined in Part 5. The British media outlets have, across the period since the Vulture investigation in March 2024, continued to operate with the kind of editorial caution that the legal pressures had produced. The original 2019 framings have not been substantially restored to the historical record. The institutional protection has continued. The relationship with Harry has continued to operate in the kind of substantial estrangement that the period since Spare has produced. The various subsequent moments at which the brothers have been required to be in physical proximity, the King's coronation in May 2023, various smaller institutional moments, have been managed through the kind of careful institutional choreography that the family has organised to prevent the estrangement from producing visible public consequences. The choreography has been substantially successful. The estrangement has been preserved as the underlying reality without producing the kind of public dimensions that would have required direct institutional engagement. The relationship with Meghan has continued to operate in operational terms as the absence of substantive engagement. Meghan has not been in the same physical proximity as William at any institutional event since the 2022 funeral period. The institutional choreography has been organised to prevent the kind of physical proximity that would have required management. The choreography has been successful. The institutional rupture has been substantially preserved as the operational reality of the family's current configuration. What the cumulative period has revealed about William, in retrospective examination, is the figure that the framework has produced across his entire formation. He is the heir who has absorbed the institutional discipline that his position has imposed on him from his earliest weeks. He is the husband whose marriage to Catherine has been substantially successful by every external measure across the years that have followed the 8-year wait that produced the engagement. He is the father whose 3 children have been raised inside the institutional structures he and Catherine have organised for them. He is the figure whose institutional silences about the various controversies of his life have been the framework's standard response that the title of this documentary has characterized as burying every word. He is also in dimensions that this documentary has examined across its previous parts, the figure whose temperamental features have produced the documented incidents that the cumulative pattern has identified. The Going Ballistic of October 2018 documented by Lacey, the alleged red mist of the Nottingham Cottage incident in 2019, the various smaller moments preserved across the documentary record that have indicated the kind of institutional intensity that the framework's standard management has been organized to keep contained. What the cumulative pattern has revealed about the four women is what this documentary has been organized around. The four women, Diana, Catherine, Rose Hanbury, Meghan, have each paid different prices for the cumulative effect of being in proximity to him. Diana paid the first price. The price was the institutional absorption that her marriage to Charles had imposed on her across the years that produced William and Harry. The price was the cumulative pressure of being the most photographed woman in the world. The price was, eventually, the death itself in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel on the 31st of August 1997. William was 15. He had observed his mother's institutional absorption and her eventual death. He had carried the observation across the rest of his life. The carrying has shaped many dimensions of how he has subsequently operated. The carrying has not, however, modified the institutional formation that produced him. The institution that had absorbed his mother continued to absorb him. He absorbed it in turn. The institutional discipline that has defined his adult life has been the discipline he absorbed from the same framework that absorbed his mother. The continuity has been the framework's institutional success. The cost of the continuity was paid by Diana most severely, and by William in dimensions that have shaped his subsequent decades. Catherine paid the second price. The price was the 8 years of waiting that produced her engagement. The price was the British tabloid framing that produced Waity Katie across the years between graduation and engagement. The price was the cumulative absorption of William's institutional formation that her marriage required. The price was in dimensions that the institutional version of her position has substantially concealed, the daily reality of operating inside the household that William's particular character has produced. The cancer episode of 2024 was, in retrospective examination, one of the moments in which the cumulative pressures of her position became substantially visible to international attention. She has, by every available external measure, absorbed the cumulative pressures with the kind of institutional discipline that her position has required. The price has been paid. The price continues to be paid in the small daily reality of her continuing position as Princess of Wales. Rose Hanbury paid the third price. The price was the cumulative effect of having her name attached to William in 2019 in conditions she had not invited and could not by herself manage. The price was the years of speculation that the institutional response to the rumours had not been able to definitively resolve. The price was the cumulative effect of having her social position substantially complicated by rumours that the institutional protection of William had produced the systematic media silencing of without producing the substantive resolution that direct engagement might have permitted. She has, across the years since 2019, continued to operate as the Marchioness of Cholmondeley. She has continued in her marriage to David Roxovich. The institutional dimensions of her position have not been substantially modified by the rumours. The cumulative cost, however, has been the kind of personal exposure that her own institutional position had not been organised to absorb. Meghan paid the fourth price. The price was the institutional response that William's particular formation had organised when she had married Harry in 2018. The price was the Going Ballistic of October 2018, the instruction to divide the households immediately, the cumulative institutional dynamics that had contributed to the rupture of January 2020. The price was the departure from senior royal life that had emerged from the cumulative period. She has, across the years since 2020, constructed the post-royal life in California that we examined in the documentary about Harry. The construction has been substantially successful by various external measures. The cumulative effect of her time as a working royal, however, has been the kind of permanent feature of her subsequent life that has shaped many dimensions of her continuing public engagement with the institution she had married into. 4 women, 4 different prices. The figure at the center of the 4 prices is the figure that this documentary has been examining across its 8 parts. The figure is William as the institutional formation has produced him. The figure includes the institutional achievements that have substantially defined his public position. The figure also includes the temperamental features that the cumulative pattern has revealed. What this documentary has been working toward across its 8 parts is the closing meditation on what the cumulative pattern actually means. The pattern is the pattern. The framework that produced William is the framework. The choices that William has made within the framework's institutional structures have been his choices. The institutional inadequacies that have failed to fully address the temperamental features that emerged in him across his formation have been the framework's institutional inadequacies. Both responsibilities are real, neither cancels the other. What this documentary has not produced is the kind of clean moral resolution that would allow William's case to be reduced to either the figure his defenders have produced in their respective framings, or the figure his critics have produced in theirs. The figure is more complicated than either reduction would accommodate. He was the institutionally formed heir whose preparation began in infancy. He was the boy whose mother died when he was 15, and whose grief was processed through the institutional codes the framework had organized, rather than through the substantive psychological intervention that contemporary understanding would have considered appropriate. He was the husband who waited 8 years before producing the engagement that his relationship with Catherine had been progressing toward. He was the heir whose institutional response to the 4 women in his life has been the cumulative pattern this documentary has examined. He is the future king whose accession will in the years ahead produce the reign that the framework has been organizing him to occupy. All of these are him. All are real. The framework that has produced him cannot fully be held responsible for the choices he has made within the conditions the framework has imposed. The choices he has made cannot fully be assessed without acknowledging the conditions the framework has imposed. Both responsibilities are real. Neither cancels the other. The figure who has emerged from the cumulative examination is the complicated figure that the title of this documentary has identified, the heir whose institutional position has substantially organized his life, whose temperamental features have produced the documented incidents we have examined, whose 4 women have paid the cumulative prices the institutional dynamics have imposed. The framework continues. The institution continues. King Charles continues his reign, modified by the cancer treatment, whose specific trajectory has not been fully publicly disclosed. William continues as Prince of Wales, preparing for the eventual succession that his birth had organized for him. The framework's traditional mechanisms continue to operate around the senior royals who remain inside the institution. The 4 women whose lives have intersected with William's continue, in their respective dimensions, to operate inside the cumulative effects that the period this documentary has examined has imposed on them. Diana is dead. She has been dead for 28 years. The cumulative effect of her death continues to shape every dimension of how the British royal family operates. William's eventual reign will, in some sense, be conducted across the long shadow of his mother's death. The shadow is real. The shadow does not, however, fully determine what kind of king he will become. The framework that produced him is the framework. The choices he will make as king will be his choices. The historical record will, across his eventual reign, document what the choices actually produce. Catherine is alive. She is recovering from her cancer treatment. She continues to be the figure whose institutional partnership with William has been the foundation of his current daily life. She has, by every available account, been absorbing the cumulative pressures of her position with the institutional discipline that the framework has required. The continuing absorption is the daily reality of her current life. The cumulative effects of the absorption may, across the years that follow, be examined in dimensions that the current institutional management has substantially concealed. They may not. The framework's institutional silences may continue to operate as they have operated. The historical record will eventually contain whatever the institutional dynamics permit it to contain. Rose Hanbury is alive. She continues, by every available account, to operate as the Marchioness of Cholmondeley. The cumulative effects of the rumours that emerged in 2019 have continued to shape various dimensions of her social position. She has not, across the years since the March 2024 lawyer's statement, produced any further public engagement with the rumours. The institutional silences continue to operate. The cumulative case remains the kind of unresolved historical question that subsequent generations of biographers will continue to examine. Meghan is alive. She continues in California the post-royal life that the rupture of January 2020 has imposed on her. The 2 children she shares with Harry, Archie and Lilibet, continue to be raised in the conditions that her decisions have organized for them. The cumulative institutional rupture with William has not been substantially modified across the years since 2020. The estrangement has been preserved as the operational reality. The historical record will continue to develop across the years that follow. What this documentary has been about, across its 8 parts, is the cumulative pattern that the 4 women's cases have made visible. The pattern has been examined. The pattern is now part of the historical record that the cumulative public discourse will continue to engage with across the years that follow. The institutional silences from Kensington Palace will likely continue to operate. The cumulative information that has continued to develop independently of the silences has, however, also continued to operate. The dual reality, institutional silence alongside continuing development of the documentary record, has been the framework's contemporary operational reality. The reality will continue. The closing meditation that this documentary produces is the meditation on what the cumulative pattern has revealed. William is the heir. He has been the heir from the moment of his birth. The framework that produced him organized itself around the institutional weight of the position he occupies. The institutional formation has produced the figure he has become. The figure has produced the documented pattern this documentary has examined. The 4 women have paid the prices the cumulative pattern has imposed. The historical record now holds the pattern. Both pictures of William are real. The institutionally successful future king whose marriage to Catherine has produced 3 children, and whose public engagement has been substantially admired by the British public. This picture is real. The figure whose temperamental features have produced the cumulative pattern that the 4 women have absorbed. This picture is also real. The pictures are not contradictory in any simple sense. They operate together. The framework that produced both is the framework. The choices that William has made have been his choices. The cumulative effect has been what this documentary has examined. The accession will come. The accession will, when it comes, produce the institutional moment in which William's eventual reign begins. The reign will be conducted across the cumulative weight of the framework that has produced him, and the cumulative pattern that this documentary has examined. The reign will be examined in its own time by historians and biographers who will produce their own retrospective assessments of what kind of King William turned out to become. The retrospective assessments will be conducted with access to information that the current period has not yet fully made available. The cumulative documentary record will continue to develop. What this documentary has produced in its examination of the 4 women whose lives have intersected with William's is one contribution to the cumulative documentary record. The contribution is partial. The contribution is, however, real. The pattern the 4 women's cases have revealed is the pattern that this documentary has been organized to make visible. The visibility is the contribution. He had been the heir. He continues to be the heir. He will, in the years ahead, become king. The framework that has produced him has been organized for the eventual succession. The cumulative pattern this documentary has examined has been operating across the period of his preparation. The pattern will continue to operate in modified forms across the years that follow. The 4 women will continue to operate inside the cumulative effects of what the pattern has imposed on them. The framework will continue to operate as the framework has been organized to operate. That is the story this documentary has been about. That is the figure William has been, across the long arc of his 4 decades, in the conditions his birth and his choices and the institutional framework that surrounded him had together imposed. That is the cumulative pattern that the 4 women's cases have made visible. That is what the historical record now holds about the heir who will in the years ahead become king. The framework continues, the institution continues, William continues preparing for the succession that his birth has organized for him. The 4 women continue, each in her own dimension, inside the cumulative effects that this documentary has examined. The pattern that the cumulative examination has produced is now part of the historical record that subsequent assessments will continue to engage with. That is the complete story. That is what the cumulative examination of his life and the 4 women's cases has produced. That is the figure Prince William has been in the conditions his particular formation and the institutional framework that surrounded him had together imposed across the 4 decades of his life. The institutional posture William has maintained toward the British press across his adult life has been the substantial expression of the foundational hostility we examined in Part 2. The hostility had its origins in his mother's death and in his cumulative observation of how the British tabloid press had pursued his mother across her adult life. The hostility has been carried, across the decades that followed, into the various dimensions of his subsequent institutional posture toward the press. The dimensions have been, in their cumulative effect, the substantial institutional confrontation between William and the British media that has operated across his entire adult life. What this part of the documentary will examine is the specific dimension of that confrontation that has shaped many of the institutional dynamics around the 4 women's cases we have been examining. The press has been the institutional figure whose conduct has produced many of the conditions that the 4 women have absorbed. The press has also been the institutional figure that William's particular response to has shaped many of the cumulative dynamics that the 4 women's cases have produced. The press wars are not in any sense separate from the 4 women's cases. The press wars have been operating alongside the 4 women's cases. The cumulative effect has been the institutional environment that all of the cases have operated within. The 2005 to 2007 phone hacking scandal that we have referenced in earlier parts was the foundational moment in the development of William's institutional posture toward the British press in his adult life. The scandal had emerged when Clive Goodman, the royal editor of News of the World, had been arrested in August 2006 along with the private investigator Glenn Mulcair on charges of hacking voicemails of members of the royal family. The investigation had been triggered in part by William's own observation in November 2005 that an article News of the World had published about him appeared to have been based on information that could only have been obtained through the interception of his voicemails. William had registered the suspicion. William had communicated it to ITV royal correspondent Tom Bradby. The communication had eventually reached the Metropolitan Police. The investigation that followed had produced the criminal convictions of Goodman and Mulcair in 2007. What this had revealed, however, was substantially less than what was actually occurring. The 2005 to 2007 investigation had concluded that the phone hacking was substantially limited to Goodman and Mulcair. The conclusion had been substantially incorrect. The wider scandal, when it emerged in 2011, would reveal that phone hacking had been substantially institutionalized practice across multiple British tabloid outlets over the course of years. The 2005 to 2007 investigation had failed to identify the scale of the practice. The failure had been, in retrospective examination, the kind of institutional inadequacy that British policing and regulation of the press had produced across the period. What had also occurred, in the period following Goodman's conviction, was the institutional response from newsgroup newspapers, the publishing arm of Rupert Murdoch's News International. The response had included, by various subsequent disclosures, the kind of legal arrangements that would have substantial consequences for William's eventual institutional position. In 2006, Goodman had apologized in court to Harry, William, and their father Charles. The newspaper had also produced apologies to the various royal figures who had been victims of the hacking. The institutional response had been, in operational terms, the kind of accommodation that News International had offered to prevent the broader scandal from developing further at that point. What had not been publicly disclosed at the time was the institutional arrangement that had reportedly been negotiated between the senior royal family and News International across the period that followed. The arrangement was, by Harry's subsequent court filings in his own phone hacking lawsuit, a secret agreement between the royal family and the publisher. The agreement had reportedly included the commitment that the royal family would not pursue further legal action against News International in exchange for institutional accommodations that the publisher had provided. The agreement had been, by Harry's subsequent characterization, the institutional mechanism that had prevented him from pursuing his own legal claims for years. The publisher denied that any such agreement had been reached. What was eventually publicly disclosed in the court documents that emerged in April 2023 was the specific dimension of the post-2007 arrangement that involved William directly. William had received in 2020 what the court documents characterized as a very large sum of money in a settlement with newsgroup newspapers concerning the phone hacking that had affected him. The settlement had been negotiated entirely behind the scenes. The settlement had not been publicly disclosed at the time of its conclusion. The settlement had been the institutional resolution of William's own claims against the publisher, conducted with the kind of complete institutional discretion that the framework's standard practices had organized. The disclosure of the settlement in April 2023 had institutional consequences that William had not been entirely able to manage. The disclosure had been produced by Harry's lawyers in the course of his own ongoing litigation against newsgroup newspapers. Harry's legal team had referenced William's settlement as part of their argument that Harry's own claims should not be thrown out for being filed too late. The reference had been, by Harry's own characterization, a shield rather than a sword. The institutional context that the disclosure provided had been substantively necessary to Harry's case. The disclosure had, however, also had the effect of revealing dimensions of William's institutional dealings with the British press that the institutional silence had previously concealed. What this revealed about William's institutional posture in retrospective examination was specific. He had absorbed, across his adult life, the foundational hostility toward the British tabloid press that we examined in Part 2. He had also, in his own institutional decisions about how to manage the hostility, adopted approaches that had been substantially different from the approaches Harry would later adopt. William had pursued the institutional route. The institutional route had included quiet settlements, secret agreements, the production of compensation conducted entirely behind the institutional curtains that the framework provided. Harry, by contrast, had pursued the public legal route. The public legal route had included open litigation, public testimony, the production of judgments through the formal mechanisms of British courts. The two approaches had revealed, in their cumulative effect, the temperamental differences between the two brothers that we have examined across this documentary. William had absorbed the institutional codes about how senior royals managed press relations. The codes had organized the discretion that had produced the secret 2020 settlement. Harry had rejected the institutional codes. The rejection had produced the open legal proceedings that we examined in the documentary about Harry. The two approaches had been, in some sense, the two available responses to the foundational hostility that both brothers had carried from their mother's death. William had institutionalized his hostility. Harry had publicized his. What the institutional approach had also produced, however, was the kind of substantial protection of William's continuing position that the public approach would not have provided. The 2020 settlement had been, in operational terms, the resolution of William's claims without producing the public disclosures that open litigation would have required. The institutional protection had been substantial. The protection had also, however, depended on the kind of secret arrangements that subsequent court disclosures would eventually make visible. The institutional management had succeeded for over a decade. The management had not in the end fully prevented the disclosure of the dimensions that the management had been organized to keep contained. What had also been operating across the same period was William's institutional posture toward the various other British tabloid outlets whose conduct had affected the family. The most substantial recent development in this dimension had been William's lawsuit against Mirror Group newspapers, the publisher of the Daily Mirror and the Sunday Mirror, that emerged in 2024. The lawsuit had been filed by William alongside other claimants. The claim had been settled in 2024. The settlement amount had not been publicly disclosed. The institutional resolution had been again the kind of behind-the-scenes settlement that the framework's traditional practices produced. The cumulative pattern across William's various press-related legal actions has been the consistent institutional approach. He has pursued legal remedies. He has settled the actions. The settlements have been conducted with the kind of institutional discretion that has prevented the public disclosure of the underlying conduct in any substantive way. The pattern has been, in operational terms, the institutional management that the framework's traditional logic has organized for senior royal figures' relationships with the press. What this has produced, across William's adult life, has been a particular kind of relationship with the British press that has not always been visible in the public dimensions. The visible dimensions have included his various public statements about the press, the various small institutional moments at which his hostility toward the tabloids has manifested in ways the public has registered, the cumulative impression of a senior royal figure whose relationship with the press has been substantial but substantially controlled. The less visible dimensions have included the secret settlements, the institutional accommodations, the various forms of institutional management that the framework's standard practices have produced. The broader institutional context for William's press posture has been the cumulative effect of the British tabloid press's conduct toward the four women this documentary has examined. Diana had been, as we examined in Part 1 and Part 2, the principal subject of British tabloid pursuit across the years before her death. The tabloid pursuit had contributed to the conditions that produced her death. William's foundational hostility had been organized around the cumulative effect of the tabloid pursuit on his mother. The hostility had been the foundational psychological architecture that his subsequent adult life had carried. Catherine had been, as we examined in Part 3, the subject of the Waity Katie framing that the British tabloids had produced across the 8 years between graduation and engagement. The framing had been institutionally damaging. The framing had been the kind of cumulative tabloid coverage that William's foundational hostility had identified as the institutional offence his position required him to address. He had not, in the period of the Waity Katie framing, produced substantial public response. He had, however, registered the framing in the way his temperament was organized to register such things. The registration had been preserved across the years. Rose Hanbury had been, as we examined in Part 5, the subject of the institutional response that William's lawyers had produced when the 2019 rumours emerged. The institutional response had succeeded in substantially containing the British media coverage of the rumours. The response had been the institutional protection that William's position had organised. The response had also imposed on Hanbury the cumulative cost that her own position had not been organised to absorb. The price had been paid. Meghan had been, as we examined in Part 6, the subject of the differential racial coverage that British tabloids had produced across the period of her engagement and marriage. The coverage had been substantively different from the coverage of the white royal women who had previously occupied comparable positions. The coverage had contributed to the conditions that had produced the rupture of January 2020. William's institutional response to Meghan's situation had been, as we examined, the response that contributed to the cumulative dynamics that produced the rupture. The response had not in any sense been the institutional defense of Meghan against the differential tabloid coverage that the institution might, in different framings of the situation, have organized. The differential is significant. William had organized substantial institutional protection of his own position against tabloid intrusion. He had not organized comparable institutional protection of Meghan against the differential coverage she absorbed. The institutional protection had been distributed unequally. The distribution had been the institutional reality that the cumulative period had produced. What this revealed about the framework's institutional management of press relations was specific. The framework had organized, across decades, the kind of institutional protection that senior male royals had received against tabloid intrusion. The protection had been less consistently extended to senior royal women, particularly those whose positions in the family had been more recent. Diana had been the principal earlier example of the differential. Diana had not received across her marriage to Charles the kind of institutional protection that the family's senior male figures had received. The cumulative effect of the differential had contributed to the conditions that produced her death. Meghan, in different forms across a different period, had been the contemporary example of the same institutional differential. The differential had operated, the cost had been paid by the women. The cumulative documentary record this part has been examining is the record of the institutional dynamics that have operated alongside the four women's cases across William's adult life. The dynamics have been substantial. The dynamics have been substantially concealed by the institutional management practices that the framework's traditional logic has produced. The dynamics have, however, also been increasingly visible across the contemporary period as various legal proceedings, biographical disclosures, and journalistic investigations have continued to develop the documentary record independently of the institutional management. The institutional management continues. William continues in his current position as Prince of Wales to manage his relationship with the British press through the institutional codes that his entire adult life has organised. The codes have produced the cumulative pattern this part has examined. The pattern will continue to operate across the years that follow. The eventual succession that we will examine in the final part will be conducted in the institutional environment that the cumulative pattern has produced. The pattern is now part of the historical record. The continuing development of the record will be the subject of subsequent biographical examinations of William's reign once that reign has begun. In the final part, we move to the closing meditation that this documentary has been working toward. The contemporary moment, the eventual succession, the four women whose lives have intersected with William's, the cumulative pattern that the four women's cases and the press wars have made visible, the figure at the center of the pattern, the framework that produced him, the historical record that now holds both pictures of him. Thanks for watching the full documentary. If you like this type of documentary, then please stay with us by subscribing to our channel.